This is a compilation of over 3 hours of Fallout's vault lore to fall asleep to. So sit back, relax, and grab your popcorn. Let's kick things off with the 7 levels of Fallout vaults. These are the 7 levels of Fallout vaults. Level 1, Trash Vaults. These are the boring ones, the ones that actually worked like advertised. Out of 122 vaults built across America, only 17 were straight-up normal shelters where people could ride out the apocalypse without Vault-Tec pulling some twisted experiment. Places like Vault 8 and Vault 76 fall into this category. They got their GX terraforming kits, their water chips didn't mysteriously fail, nobody was secretly dosing the air supply with hallucinogens, and they weren't filled with a man named Gary. Vault 8 in Nevada is the poster child here. It only opened 4 years later than it was supposed to. The dwellers used their Garden of Eden creation kit to terraform the wasteland, and boom, they founded Vault City by 2091. The place became this weirdly functional post-apocalyptic settlement with actual infrastructure and governance. Vault 76 in West Virginia is another control vault, the one you start in during Fallout 76. It was designed to open exactly 25 years after the bombs dropped on Reclamation Day, and it actually did. No weird twists or surprise cannibalism, just a bunch of people walking out into the wasteland to rebuild America like the brochures promised. These vaults matter because they prove Vault-Tec could have saved people if they wanted to. They had the technology and resources to build genuine Fallout shelters, but instead they chose to run sick experiments on 105 of the 122 vaults they constructed. But here's the thing, if Vault-Tec could build 17 working vaults, why make 105 death traps? Keep that question in mind, because the answer isn't what you think. Now let's see what happened when they started testing isolation. Level 2, Isolation Vaults. This level is where Vault-Tec started testing how humans handle being completely cut off from everything. Vault 101 from Fallout 3 is the most famous example. The tagline was literally Vault 101, Jewel of the Wastes, but the real experiment was that nobody was ever supposed to leave, ever. The Overseer had standing orders to keep that vault sealed indefinitely, and anyone who even talked about opening the door was labeled a dissident. Your character's dad breaking this rule by escaping to find a water purifier is what kicks off the entire main quest of Fallout 3. Vault 13 from the original Fallout also falls here, though with a different spin. It was designed to stay sealed for 200 years to study prolonged isolation, but their water chip conveniently failed after just a few decades, forcing them to send someone out into the wasteland. That someone becomes the Vault Dweller, the protagonist of the first game, who has to trek across California looking for replacement parts. The whole water chip failure might have been intentional sabotage by Vault-Tec to see what happens when isolated communities face extinction-level equipment failures. Vault 21 in New Vegas took isolation in a weird direction by making everything inside decided by gambling. Every dispute, every decision, every allocation of resources came down to games of chance. It worked surprisingly well until Mr. House showed up and won the vault in a game of blackjack, then filled most of it with concrete. The isolation experiments reveal Vault-Tec's obsession with control and obedience. They wanted to know if they could create perfectly insulated societies that would follow orders without question. Communities so indoctrinated they'd never challenge authority even when it meant their own doom. These vaults often developed cult-like social structures where the Overseer was basically a dictator and questioning the system was heresy. The psychological damage from these experiments lasted generations, creating societies that couldn't adapt when they finally did open and face the real wasteland. But isolation was just psychology. What comes next is where Vault-Tec started weaponizing human needs themselves, and one vault proves they'd even weaponize people's recovery just to watch them destroy each other. Level 3, Survival Experiments. Now Vault-Tec wanted to see what happens when you give people just barely enough, or way too much of something specific. Vault 34 is the perfect example of too much. This vault near Vegas was stuffed with an absolutely insane amount of weapons and ammunition, way more than any civilian shelter would ever need. The experiment was basically what happens when everyone has unlimited access to guns in a confined space. Spoiler alert, they formed armed factions, fought over the reactor, and when it leaked radiation, most of them died. The survivors became the Boomers, that artillery-obsessed faction at Nellis Air Force Base who shoot at literally anyone who gets close. Vault 22 tested resource scarcity from a different angle, focusing on food production. They were experimenting with mutated plant spores to create fast-growing crops, which sounds genius until you learn the spores turn people into hostile plant zombie things. The scientists kept pushing their experiments even as dwellers started transforming, and eventually the whole vault became overrun with these spore carriers. You explore this nightmare in New Vegas, fighting through fungus-infected tunnels and mutated plants while reading terminal entries about how the scientists knew exactly what was happening and kept going anyway. Vault 95 weaponized addiction and recovery. It was advertised as a rehabilitation facility for chem addicts, a clean space where people could get sober and stay sober. For 5 years, it actually worked. People kicked their habits and built a supportive community. Then, as planned, Vault-Tec had a plan to open a secret stash of chems in the walls. The resulting relapse destroyed everything. Dwellers turned on each other and the vault fell apart. When you find it in Fallout 4, it's occupied by gunners who are using it as a base, completely unaware of the deliberately engineered tragedy that happened there. These experiments were Vault-Tec's way of studying human behavior under extreme conditions, specifically how societies function when basic needs become weapons. The data they collected was supposedly for planning long-term space colonization, figuring out minimum resource requirements for generation ships or Mars colonies, but really it was just corporate-funded sadism dressed up as science, watching people suffer for spreadsheets and graphs, or so it seemed, because every experiment was teaching Vault-Tec something specific about human breaking points. The question is, why did they need to know? Level 4, Social Experiment. This is where Vault-Tec crossed a different line. They weren't just studying how people break. They were discovering how to make people build entire societies around their own destruction. Vault 11 proves it, and what the computer told the last 5 survivors reveals exactly what Vault-Tec learned about human nature. Vault 11 is hands down one of the darkest experiments in the entire franchise. The Vault's computer told residents they had to sacrifice one person every year or everyone would die. They developed this whole electoral system where they'd vote for an overseer, who would then be executed. Candidates used propaganda, bribery, and blackmail to avoid winning. Voting blocks formed, people manipulated elections, and this went on for years until one election cycle failed and only 5 people remained. They refused to sacrifice anyone, and when they finally told the computer no, it revealed the whole thing was a test and they'd actually passed by refusing. But by then, 4 of them killed each other in the aftermath, and only one survived, completely broken. That's the discovery Vault-Tec was after. Give humans the right rules, and they'll create systems that destroy them without question. They'll accept authority even when it's killing them. This data was worth everything to someone. But who? Vault 118 up in Far Harbor ran a class experiment. They divided the vault into sectors for rich elites and poor workers. But the workers section was never completed, so it ended up being just 10 ultra-wealthy people isolated together. And they eventually transferred their consciousnesses into robot bodies to achieve immortality. When you arrive, they're still there as these brainbots, completely unaware that centuries have passed and they're essentially digital ghosts acting out their pre-war aristocratic fantasies. Vault 19 in the Mojave tested paranoia by deliberately dividing dwellers into 2 groups, red and blue, and giving them separate sections of the vault. The computer systems were rigged to make each side think the other was sabotaging them. Subliminal messages, fake alerts, manipulated supply counts, all designed to manufacture conflict where none existed. Eventually, both groups abandoned the vault rather than fight, which is almost a happy ending by Vault-Tec standards. Vault 112 might be the cruelest. Dr. Braun, the overseer, trapped everyone in virtual reality pods running a simulation he controlled. For over 200 years, he's been psychologically torturing them, forcing them to live through scenario after scenario where he plays God. They can't die, can't escape, just endless cycles of whatever twisted narrative Braun feels like inflicting. Your interaction with this vault in Fallout 3 involves entering the simulation, and either helping the residents escape or helping Braun torture them more. Because even the player isn't safe from these moral nightmares. The social experiments prove Vault-Tec understood human psychology well enough to break it systematically. These weren't random acts of cruelty. They were carefully designed scenarios testing specific hypotheses about authority, conformity, and social collapse. The Enclave wanted this data for colonization projects, figuring out exactly how much stress a closed society could handle before fracturing. Level 5, Evolution Experiments. Everything up to now was psychology and social control, but these next vaults reveal something darker. Vault-Tec wasn't trying to save humanity. They were trying to replace it, and in Vault 87, they actually succeeded. Vault 87 sits at the top of this category. This vault in the Capital Wasteland wasn't a shelter at all. It was a research facility testing the forced evolutionary virus. They were supposed to study FEV effects on human subjects, but study quickly became mass mutation experiment. Nearly every dweller was transformed into super mutants, those giant green monsters that populate the Capital Wasteland. The vault became ground zero for the East Coast super mutant population, and you can find it in Fallout 3, still crawling with mutants and radiation so intense that approaching from certain directions will kill you instantly. One of the few survivors who kept his mind is Fox, the super mutant companion you can recruit who was intelligent enough to realize what happened and hates Vault-Tec for it. Vault 92 ran audio-based mind control experiments. They filled this vault with musicians, supposedly to preserve performing arts through the apocalypse. But the real plan involved subliminal messaging hidden in white noise played constantly through the vault's speaker system. The messages were supposed to create super soldiers by conditioning extreme aggression and obedience to commands. Instead, everyone went violently insane, killing each other in brutal rampages. When you explore it in Fallout 3, you find terminal entries from a violinist who slowly realizes the music is changing him, making him angry and violent, but he can't stop it or escape. Vault 96 in Fallout 76 was sold as an animal preservation project, basically Noah's Ark for wasteland creatures. What residents didn't know was that Vault-Tec was using them to test aggressive mutation serums on the animals. They had quotas for genetic modifications, pushing mutations harder and faster to see what would happen. Predictably, the creatures became unstable and dangerous, and after the dwellers died to the Vault's mainframe activating a superseding security protocol during their failed escape attempt, the mutated creatures escaped. The specimens went into Appalachia, which explains some of the more horrifying mutated wildlife you encounter. Vault 75. Beneath a middle school ran a eugenics program focused on children. Kids were separated from parents on entry, told their families died, and raised in an underground facility that constantly tested them through brutal competition. The weakest were reclaimed, which Vault-Tec speaks of being murdered and harvested for genetic material. The strongest were bred to create perfect specimens. The scientists pushed this for generations until the teenagers eventually figured it out and revolted, killing all the researchers. You can explore this vault in Fallout 4 and read the heartbreaking terminal entries from both the kids and the scientists who rationalized atrocity as progress. Each experiment maps perfectly to a specific problem, but what problem were they solving? That's next. These biological experiments represent Vault-Tec at its most callous, treating human life as raw material for science. The goal was ostensibly to understand genetic manipulation and create enhanced humans for space colonization, but the methods were straight out of the worst moments in human history. Eugenics programs and unethical medical experimentation cranked up to apocalyptic extremes. Level 6. Experimental vaults. These vaults tested one final variable: minimum viable systems. How little technology do you need to keep humans alive in a closed environment? Because if you're noticing that every experiment sounds like preparation for something, you're right, and what comes after this explains everything. Vault 88, which you can explore and build in Fallout 4's DLC, was designed to test prototype Vault-Tec technologies on unwitting subjects. The Overseer, who survived as a ghoul, was working on devices like exercise bikes that drained life force, soda machines that dispensed chems, and slot machines rigged for behavior modification. The Vault was never finished before the bombs dropped, so the experiments never ran at full scale. But you can choose to complete them yourself or sabotage the Overseer's plans and make the technology actually helpful. Vault 114 took a different approach, experimenting with leadership structures through architecture. This vault beneath a subway station in Boston was deliberately designed to be uncomfortable. The Overseer's room was a transparent office in the middle of everything with zero privacy, and the whole vault was built to create constant tension between authority figures and residents. The idea was to test if leaders could maintain control when they had no special privileges or private space. Construction never finished before the war, so the experiment never ran, but the criminal Skinny Malone moved in and made it his headquarters in Fallout 4. Vault 108 had a cloning lab because Vault-Tec wanted to know what happens when you can mass-produce humans. The Overseer was terminally ill, and the plan was to clone one resident named Gary over and over to study hive mind dynamics and identity degradation. Instead, the Garys gained sentience as a collective, realized they were being used, and turned on everyone else. By the time you reach this vault in Fallout 3, it's entirely populated by hostile Gary clones who can only say their own name, creating this deeply unsettling atmosphere where every enemy is the same person copied hundreds of times. Vault 106 tested chemical warfare technology through psychoactive drugs pumped into the ventilation system. The gas was supposed to induce hallucinations and paranoia, which it absolutely did. 10 days after the vault sealed, dwellers started experiencing vivid hallucinations and violent delusions. The vault descended into chaos as people attacked hallucinations that looked like their friends and family. Centuries later, when you explore it, the gas is still active, causing the lone wanderer to hallucinate during exploration, seeing fake enemies and distorted versions of reality. The technology experiments show Vault-Tec's complete disregard for safety protocols or ethics. They were testing prototype devices that should have gone through decades of trials, instead throwing them into live environments with real people. The Enclave wanted data on cutting-edge tech for their projects, and Vault-Tec was happy to provide it regardless of cost. These vaults often left behind functioning but dangerous technology that wastelanders stumbled into, creating new threats centuries after the original experiments ended. Level 7. Legendary Vaults. Here's what every single experiment was actually for. Vault-Tec and the Enclave weren't preparing to survive nuclear war, they were preparing to leave Earth entirely. According to Fallout's co-creator Tim Kaine, Vault-Tec and the Enclave designed these experiments to gather data for an interstellar colonization project. They believed Earth might become completely uninhabitable and wanted to understand how humans would survive on generation ships traveling to other planets. Every experiment tested a different variable relevant to space travel. Isolation mirrors deep space missions, resource scarcity reflects limited ship supplies, social engineering explores governance and closed systems, biological experiments prepare for alien environments, and technology tests determine minimum viable systems. The Enclave, remnants of the US government, monitored all the vaults from remote locations, collecting data transmitted from each overseer. They planned to USC this research to select the strongest survivors for their ARC project if Earth truly became unlivable. The vaults were essentially massive lab rats, with 105 out of 122 facilities running some kind of experiment while the 17 control vaults provided baseline data. The vaults were never shelters. They were simulations of generation ships, and every person who walked into one thinking they'd be saved became a test subject for humanity's escape plan. But here's where it gets even darker. Vault-Tec sold this to the government by framing it as necessary preparation for humanity's survival, the ultimate contingency plan that required extreme measures. The Fallout TV series that dropped in 2024 adds another layer to this. It reveals Vault-Tec executives meeting before the war, discussing their experiments and plans. Vaults 31 through 33 form a connected system where Vault 31 holds cryogenically frozen Vault-Tec management who periodically wake up to oversee and manipulate the other two vaults, essentially creating a perpetual corporation that outlives the apocalypse. The show hints that Vault-Tec might have had a hand in starting the Great War itself, ensuring their vaults would be needed and their experiments could proceed. While that's not confirmed in game canon, it fits the pattern of corporate evil that defines Vault-Tec's legacy. What makes this endgame truly disturbing is the scale of the lie. Vault-Tec spent billions of dollars, involved thousands of employees, and built 122 facilities, all while maintaining the facade of salvation. The advertising, the Vault Boy mascot giving thumbs up, the cheerful instructional videos about surviving atomic war, it was all marketing for the largest unethical human experiment in history. Families bought into this promise of safety, paid for vault spots, and walked into their assigned shelters thinking they'd secured their future. Instead, they became test subjects in scenarios designed to break them. The data collected from these experiments supposedly justified the suffering, providing insights into human psychology and society under extreme stress. But even if the Enclave used this information for space colonization, it doesn't change what happened to the people trapped in vaults, living their entire lives as unwitting participants in someone else's grand design. Vault survivors who emerged into the wasteland, either because their vault failed or succeeded, spread across America and influenced the formation of major factions. The new California Republic traces its roots to vault dwellers. The Brotherhood of Steel interacted with vault technology constantly, and super mutants from vault experiments shaped entire regions. The Vault-Tec Corporation itself was deeply embedded in pre-war America, with university campuses, demonstration vaults, and promotional centers spreading their brand. Vault-Tec University in Fallout 76 was a training facility for vault personnel, but even there, Vault-Tec ran experiments, starving the students to test emergency rationing protocols. The demonstration vault in Los Angeles, which appears in Fallout 1, was meant to show off vault technology to potential customers, but later became the master's base of operations, proving that even Vault-Tec's public relations efforts came back to haunt the wasteland. Vault-Tec didn't fail, they succeeded. Every experiment proved what they wanted to know: humans adapt. We suffer, obey, rebuild, and survive. Even after centuries of cruelty, their systems still echo through the wasteland. Almost every vault in Fallout is horrifying, because that's the point. They were experiments meant to test what people would do in horrible situations. But there are some that are so bad, they'll make you question the sanity of the devs that created them. So with that cheerful note out of the way, let's go traumatize ourselves. First things first, let's cover Ol' Reliable. Vault 22, the green hell. In every other vault, you eat plants. In Vault 22, the plants eat you. Vault 22 is easily one of Fallout's most infamous vaults, and does deserve a spot on this list. I don't know, it just feels like everyone who has made a video on vaults or New Vegas has talked about it, and I'd be torn apart in the comments section if I didn't cover it here. So here we go. The vault was staffed by pre-war scientists trying to solve global hunger by genetically modifying crops. It's a noble idea, since even ignoring the rest of the world who are undoubtedly doing worse. By the 2070s, in the USA, international trade had collapsed. The US population had ballooned past 400 million, and shortage riots becoming more and more common. Feeding America was becoming a problem. Vault 22 was supposed to be the solution to that problem, and it was promising. The government and a few private partners donated plenty of money and biosamples, including a new fungal strain from the geniuses over at Big Mountain Research Facility. That fungus, Bovaria mordicana, was basically Fallout's version of Cordyceps from The Last of Us. It infected its host, killed it, then puppeted the corpse to spread spores to new victims. Its purpose was to eradicate pests that would usually ruin crops. Unfortunately, it had three main issues. The first was it took as long as 3 weeks from infection to kill the pest. The second was because of the way it spread. Needing close proximity to spores, it didn't work with any animals that weren't social and spent time around others. And third, it could infect people, and that was the true experiment of Vault 22. Big Mountain, in collaboration with Vault-Tec, wanted to see what would happen in a sealed environment with a recycled air system and a few hundred test subjects. The infection spread fast. Vault dwellers started getting chills, fevers, and a hacking cough, caused by the fungus coating the lungs. The fungus sunk deep into the body, enough to force it to violently reject any antifungal treatments. Eventually, organs shut down and people died. And then we get to the bad part, because then people got back up again, as spore carriers, who would attack any uninfected. By 2296, the Vault was in chaos with an airborne plague and literal zombies. The last scientists planned to flood the lowest level with gas and ignite it, going literal scorched earth to try and burn out the infection. But the spore carriers somehow sensed the gas and swarmed the team before they could trigger the blast. By 2096, barely 20 years after the Great War, Vault 22 was lost. The survivors fled north, leaving the door open behind them. The plants grew unchecked, covering the vault and the surrounding area in lush greenery. A stark, horrifying contrast to the surrounding Mojave Desert. Thankfully, the spores aren't seemingly able to spread in the open air, but anyone foolish enough to go inside never comes back. The vault green exterior lures explorers in, and the spore carriers make sure they stay forever. And the story doesn't even end there. The handful of survivors who escaped fled into Zion National Park. Hardened by what they'd seen, they became isolationist, violent, and worse, still infected. Some died of the disease. Others died when a certain very angry army veteran went open season on them after they ate the locals to survive. Their bodies eventually rose again and retreated into Zion's caves, where the fungus could grow undisturbed. As for the last survivors of Vault 22 that fled once again out of Zion, we never hear from them again. But given their social skills and the fact they were infected, I don't think they or anyone else around them had a happy ending. But hey, at least throughout it all, they never fell into infighting. The same can't be said of the next vault. Vault 11, the death penalty vault, deep in the Mojave sits Vault 11. And unlike most vaults, it's completely empty. When its residents first entered, the door sealed shut behind them and couldn't be opened. And the vault computer told them of the vault's special rule each year: one person must enter a special execution chamber. If they didn't do that, the vault's life support systems would shut down, killing everyone. Only the original overseer knew this before the door sealed. And when the others found out he'd kept it secret, they, democratically, decided that the overseer should be the first sacrifice. Thus began the proud Vault 11 tradition of electing an overseer every year and sending them to die when their term ended. Soon, elections became a twisted parody of American politics. Posters littered the halls. Don't vote for Glover. His family needs him. Rumors about Haley are baseless. Vote Stone for overseer. And just like real life, several political parties formed, large voting blocks that would pool their votes together to control who lived and who died. Over time, these blocks grew more powerful and corrupt. The leader of one of these blocks eventually forced a woman named Catherine Stoner to cheat on her husband with him, or her husband would be nominated for overseer, guaranteeing his death. She did what he said, and then the block leader nominated her husband anyway. Catherine responded with what people who study politics commonly call Plan B, mass murder. She went full Rambo, hunting down every Justice Block member she could find. In any other vault, she'd have been executed. In Vault 11, however, that would be a waste. In fact, this made her the perfect candidate for overseer. However, this was exactly what she wanted, for 3 reasons. 1. She got revenge on the voting block that betrayed her. 2. Her being nominated meant her husband wasn't, saving him. And 3. As overseer, she had the authority to alter the vault computer programming, changing the yearly selection of overseer from an election to be chosen completely and totally randomly. This, to put it lightly, was not received well. And by that, I mean a full-blown civil war erupted as the vault lost its mind with voting blocks going into all-out revolt. When the fighting finally ended, there were only 5 survivors. Those last 5, broken and done with it all, decided to end the cycle. They marched into the sacrifice chamber together, told the Vault AI that they are done. No longer will they send one to die, but they will die as one. And then, a pre-recorded message congratulated them. The Vault AI was never going to shut off the life support. They had passed the test of the vault. The vault door unlocked and they were all free to go. So all that death and chaos and betrayal was for absolutely nothing. Of the 5, 4 immediately shot themselves. The 5th walked out into the Mojave, never to be seen again. Alright, you did well sitting through a more subtle vault. We'll go to a more on-the-nose one. Vault 87. 87, the super mutant hotspot. Vault 87 is arguably the closest we get to a genuine horror movie in Fallout, or at least one that won't get them sued by Naughty Dog. Whatever its original experiment was supposed to be was scrapped in 2076, when the US government decided to repurpose it as a secondary testing site for the forced evolutionary virus. It made sense since West Tech's main facility in California was probably going to get nuked, so setting up a backup lab and a bomb-proof vault was good planning. Good for the scientists anyway, not for the residents. So when the bombs fell, the dwellers crowded into a death trap. And I mean this literally. Within the first decade or so, over 90 deaths were reported, an insane number for any vault. In most cases, the bodies were quickly disposed of, except they weren't. 90% of those deaths were fake. The so-called deceased were abducted and taken to the restricted experimental wing for FEV experiments. The virus had been modified to emphasize certain beneficial traits: strength, endurance, resistance, i.e., it created super mutants. Most subjects gained muscle mass, lost all their hair, and lost most of their brain function. At least one forgot how to breathe, and simply died. And again, I need to emphasize that transforming from FEV exposure is the most excruciating thing a human being can go through. Imagine pulling a muscle, except it's every single muscle on your body, along with every bone violently pushing and growing and morphing. And of course, it could just not work, and you end up dying as your body grows 8 spleens but destroys your lungs because FEV isn't stable. But of course, the scientists kept going because progress was progress. And of course, with so many people disappearing, much of the rest of the vault was in mourning. One technician started hearing children's voices echoing through the walls and was told he was going insane. He wasn't. He was hearing the kids from Little Lamplight, a nearby cave where children had taken refuge after the war. But that's another whole thing we might get into in another video. Another man, who was told his wife had died, decided 5 stages of grief was too much and stopped on rage. He was convinced the scientists had killed her and plotted to murder them. We don't know exactly what happened, but we can make an educated guess. The grieving husband broke into the restricted labs to attack the scientists, and the test subjects escaped in the process. Mentally broken super mutants rampaged through the vault, killing or converting everyone they found. When they ran out of people to eat or turn into more of their own, they left the vault to plague the Capital Wasteland's people, killing and eating the weak while bringing the strong back to make into more super mutants. But there's one more tragedy in this, one more twist that makes this whole thing read like a Stephen King book. The man's wife wasn't a test subject. She just died of cancer, one of the very few natural deaths in the vault. The doctors just failed to properly console a grieving man, and he went off the deep end. So Vault 87, and the entire Capital Wasteland by extension, didn't collapse because of the horrible, inhumane experiments. It collapsed because of one man's misunderstanding and the failure of doctors to realize how badly he was grieving. Unfortunately, this was not the only vault designed to turn people into abominations. Vault 12, the Living Cemetery. Vault 12 is probably the most straightforward, disturbing vault in Fallout. Located beneath Bakersfield, California, its story is simple. The vault door never fully closed. When the bombs fell on October 23, 2077, every other vault in America sealed tight, except this one. The residents entered, the door didn't close completely, and soon word spread that the vault was still open. Crowds from nearby forced their way in, cramming themselves into the vault for safety. In hindsight, it would probably have been better if they stayed outside and died. Because the jammed door wasn't a malfunction, it was intentional. The vault itself was designed to keep its inhabitants safe from raiders, famine, and any other potential factors. Except one. By keeping the door open, it guaranteed radiation could leak in. Because the experiment of this vault was to study the effects of radiation poisoning. Now, players often forget what radiation poisoning actually means. In the newer games, it's just a simple red bar pressing down on your health bar, to the point you could die from a stubbed toe. Or in Fallout 3 in New Vegas, a minor stat penalty that you can fix with a dose of Radaway. In reality, radiation doesn't just hurt you, it breaks you. It tears through the body on a cellular level, shifting atoms and shredding DNA in every cell it touches. If your body is a temple, radiation isn't damaging the building, it's replacing the bricks with mud, which causes that temple, like your body, to fall apart. And while most illnesses cause symptoms because your body is fighting back, radiation sickness is the opposite. The symptoms, vomiting, bleeding, burns, organ failure, are signs your body is literally falling apart. Your cells stop dividing properly, your tissues stop healing, and everything that keeps you alive begins to disintegrate from the inside out. It's slow, it's messy, and it's agonizing. So imagine thousands of people huddled in a vault, thinking they'd escaped death, only to spend days, weeks, or months suffering to the point they would have welcomed it. And the worst part is, some didn't even get that, because some survived. Their skin peeled away, their hair fell out, and they began rotting, but somehow they kept walking. They became ghouls, and being a ghoul is arguably worse than dying, your body rotting in slow motion, and most regular people treat you horribly, if not outright shoot you on sight, and you get to watch other ghouls go feral, knowing that one day you'll join them. The ferals don't attack you, of course, because they see you as one of them, since if you live long enough, you will be. A great thought at the back of every ghoul's mind. And whether Vault-Tec expected that outcome is anyone's guess, but the result was the same. Vault 12 became the single largest source of ghouls in all of California, if not the entire western USA. Bakersfield became Necropolis, the city of the dead. After it was destroyed by the Master's army, its survivors fled south and founded Dayglow, one of the founding cities of the NCR. So technically, Vault 12 was a success. It proved that humans could survive extreme radiation poisoning by becoming something that barely counts as human. The good news is, even after 200 years, they're still alive. The bad news is even after 200 years, they're still alive. For no other reason than the number we're jumping from Vault 12 to Vault 112. Vault 112, the virtual hell. In the Capital Wasteland, under a pretty unremarkable garage infested with mole rats, lies Vault 112. It's one of the smallest vaults in the series, but it's not the size that matters, but how much it traumatizes people. Okay, that analogy fell apart. Moving on. On paper, Vault 112 sounded like paradise. Every resident would live inside a virtual reality utopia, each person sealed in a stasis pod and uploaded into a simulation where every desire was fulfilled. In any other context, yeah, that would be dystopian. But when the world ends and you're stuck in a glorified basement, and screw it, plug me in. To make things even better, the vault's overseer was Dr. Stanislaus Braun himself, a brilliant German scientist that had moved to the US and was responsible for multiple pre-war breakthroughs, including the Garden of Eden creation kit. There wasn't anyone alive that had better knowledge of that kind of tech than him, especially after the bombs fell. If anyone could keep the simulation running, it was him. Unfortunately, Braun is the problem, because Vault 112 was his reward from Vault-Tec and the US military for years of service, a personal kingdom where he could play God, with the Dwellers as his toys. Imagine Sword Art Online and Braun was the admin. The simulation was his playground, and he got bored quickly, so he started torturing the other people for fun, sometimes physically, sometimes emotionally. But hey, the good news was, they didn't remember it, because he kept wiping their memories. The residents would suffer, then forget, and Braun would start again. An infinite loop of cheerful ignorance, sudden extreme trauma, and back to life as usual. Over and over and over again. And ignorance is bliss, because one resident, Old Lady Dithers, wasn't properly plugged into the simulation, so she was aware she was in one, and remembered the horrible stuff Braun did. I don't know what's worse, knowing that she's in a simulation, or that no one else believes her. And if you're wondering why you find them all still alive in Fallout 3 200 years later, it's because their pods keep them in biological stasis. If they step out, and they would probably die instantly, either rapidly aging or infection, but so long as they stay inside, they get to live and be tortured forever. Yay! In-game. When you go into the simulation, you get two options. Play along with Braun's twisted games until he's satisfied and lets you go. Hack the system and kill everyone but Braun, freeing the Vaulters from purgatory while trapping Braun in a new one, since he's stuck in his simulation alone forever now. You know a vault's disturbing when the good ending is just killing the residents. And speaking of killing residents, Vault 75, the eugenics vault. So the disturbing thing about Vault 75 is, well, eugenics. Yeah, just eugenics. I don't really have a fun way to sugarcoat that one. Vault 75 sits beneath Malden Middle School in the Commonwealth and offered discounted spots to students and their families. When they arrived after the bombs fell, the parents were separated for processing. They were never seen again. The children were then told that the Uptop land, or what we call the Wasteland, was a dangerous place, and that they must be trained to survive it when they become an adult. Trained, meaning a lifetime of brutal physical and mental testing until they turned 18, when they'd supposedly graduate and head to the surface to rebuild society. Of course, that was a lie. Vault 75's real purpose was to create genetically superior super soldiers. The Vault's scientists ran endless evaluations to identify exceptional genes: strength, intelligence, agility, anything that could be replicated. Also, one of the main supporters of this project was none other than Dr. Stanislaus Braun, the same German scientist from Vault 112. Some things never change. Anyway, when each child turned 18, they faced three possible fates. The physically gifted were harvested, their organs and DNA used to clone the next batch of better babies. The highly intelligent were recruited to replace the scientists and continue the experiment. Everyone else went to the incinerator. Except there's one tiny problem with this experiment. Well, besides, eugenics. Because like most people who love eugenics, Vault-Tec had absolutely no idea how genetics actually works. Eugenics, in theory, is just selective selective breeding, letting only certain members of a species reproduce to make more desirable traits. That's how we ended up with pugs, greyhounds, and basically every dog that can't breathe properly. But there isn't a 1-1 gene for everything. There's no single smart or strong gene you can just isolate. A mother with a six-pack doesn't give to a baby with a six-pack, and a rocket scientist's kid can still eat glue. However, while this experiment was eventually doomed to fail, the people inside decided to speed it up. Exact details are sparse, but here's the image I pieced together. A newly recruited junior scientist started asking why the vault never contacted its graduates on the surface. When his superiors brushed him off, he thought that was sus. So did some digging and uncovered the truth. He then secretly smuggled weapons to the kids he was supposed to supervise. And those kids, who'd spent their whole lives training to fight, used those weapons to overthrow the scientists in a violent revolt and escape. And as messed up as it is, this is one of the few Vault stories that ends with something close to a happy ending. A single compassionate scientist rejected indoctrination and instead worked with his peers to fight against a common enemy. So maybe, in a twisted way, Vault 75's experiment finally succeeded. Not in what it was meant to do, but ironically, in the lie. They created a generation of kids who were compassionate enough to unite against them, escape, and use the skills they learned to finally live above ground. Now there's plenty of other Vaults that deserve spots on this list, like Vault 4 or 51, but those will be covered in other videos. Instead, how about we do something a little different? A spin on a Vault not talked about very much on these sorts of videos because of how vanilla it seems? In my opinion, it's all 31 flavors of insanity. And to those of you who got this joke, what are you still doing up this late? Bedtime in the nursing home starts at 6 p.m. Now that I've ticked off my primary audience, it's time to double down with this honorable mention, special mention Vault 76. You can't stop me. This is my video. Now, you might be saying, but Ghoul, Vault 76 was a control vault. Everyone lived in luxury for 25 years before leaving. And to that, I say, yes. But in the words of contemporary philosopher Sala JJ, have you considered the implications? Because look, Fallout 76 is a fun game. I've had a lot of fun playing it, but fun to play doesn't mean fun to live in. Call of Duty is fun too, but if you told an Iraq veteran his dead friends just had a skill issue because you easily survived 20 gunshots in multiplayer, you're getting punched in the face. It's the same thing here. Sure, the game is easy for us to play, but imagine what our in-game characters are actually going through. Vault 76's residents, handpicked successful businessmen and women and their kids, were expecting to leave the vault and rebuild West Virginia. At best, the dangers they were prepared for were radiation poisoning, environmental pollution, and some raiders. But when those doors opened onto the lands of West Virginia, what they found wasn't almost heaven, it was complete hell. To list out that they had to deal with in no particular order. Super mutants, giant green ogres that want to kill and eat you, not necessarily in that order, or transform you into one of them, which is one of the most painful things a human being can experience. Literal zombies in the form of feral ghouls, an entire region called the Ash Heap, which is so polluted you can't find a single square inch of ground not covered in ash, which, by the way, is carried by the wind to the rest of Appalachia, guaranteeing black lung no matter where you are. Every animal suddenly grows 10 times bigger and discovers a love for human flesh. Radroaches, mirelurks, red scorpions. And who could forget the humble Deathclaw? Every single fictional monster from folklore is no longer fictional, either because it actually existed pre-war and you now have the privilege of getting eaten by it, or because the name was given to something just as if not more horrifying that was created after the war. We got the Wendigo, the Blue Devil, Chupacabra, and every flavor of Mothman you can think of. Aliens that abduct people to mutate into more monsters just to dump them back to Earth to terrorize the population. A whole new wonderful list of mutated diseases you catch just by standing in a puddle. The vast majority of robots in a region going full Skynet and murdering everything on sight. And, of course, bats the size of commercial airplanes that infect you with a plague that causes your skin to burn and grow green crystals while you slowly lose your mind to a hive mind. And yes, you feel everything. Welcome home, Vault Dweller. Country roads, take me the hell out of here. And even if you survive all that, what's the reward? You get to live another day in hell. But Ghoul, you say, we are rebuilding West Virginia. And to that, dear Strawman, I say, did you? Appalachia is never mentioned again in any later Fallout game. Not once. Yes, that's mostly because 76 came out most recently. But until it's mentioned in a future game, I'm counting a mission as canon. Fight me. All your victories, curing the Scorched Plague, saving Appalachia from disaster after disaster, building literal cities from scratch, none of it mattered. Even in Fallout 3 when you go to the pit, a stone's throw from the game area of Fallout 76, and where you actually go in Fallout 76, there's no mention of the Vault 76 dwellers anywhere, which means one thing, everything you built became dust and every sacrifice you made was erased by time. The only thing worse than failing to achieve greatness is achieving it and being completely forgotten, and personally, that's at least disturbing to me. Almost every vault dweller that lived in a vault died in a vault. From experiments to chamber rooms, most of their deaths were inevitable, but some lived to see the wasteland. So what actually happened to every vault survivor? Starting with Vault 13, screwed repeatedly. Let's start with the OG vault that kicked off this entire franchise. Vault 13 should have been simple. It was marketed as a control vault, no weird experiments, just normal people waiting out the apocalypse. Except nothing with Vault tech is ever that simple, is it? The survivors of Vault 13 got screwed over so many times, I lost count. First, their water chip breaks in 2161, which is basically the vault equivalent of your phone dying when you're lost. The Overseer picks one person, later known as the Vault Dweller, and says, "Hey, go find a replacement or we all die of thirst." No pressure though. So the Vault Dwellers leaves, spends 5 months fighting mutants and making questionable decisions, and comes back with chip. Hero status achieved, right? Wrong. The Overseer immediately exiles them because apparently saving everyone makes you too dangerous to keep around. The logic here is absolutely wild. Thanks for preventing our deaths. Now leave before you give people ideas. Classic authoritarian energy right there. But here's where it gets interesting. That exile doesn't just remove one person. It fractures the entire Vault's identity. A rebel faction that had been brewing finally explodes. They're furious that their hero got kicked out. Furious that the Overseer lied about the surface. And furious that they've been living in a metal can for decades when there's a whole world out there. So they do what any reasonable group of angry Vault Dwellers would do. They overthrow the Overseer, maybe violently. The records get real vague here, which usually means someone did something they don't want to talk about. And then, in a move that's both logical and deeply funny, they replace human leadership with a computer system bought from the Brotherhood of Steel. That's right, they traded one dictator for another, except this one runs on electricity and can't be emotionally manipulated. I'm not sure if that's an upgrade or just a different flavor of dystopia, but whatever works, I guess. For about 80 years, this actually works out okay. Vault 13 becomes a functioning community under computer rule. People live their lives, have kids, and probably complain about the recycled air. Standard Vault stuff, but then 2241 rolls around and things get worse, way worse. The Enclave, for those who don't know, are basically the US government's worst impulses given power armor and vertibirds. They send an all-clear signal to Vault 13 claiming the surface is safe and it's time to come out. The Vault, trusting that this is legitimate, opens the door. 3 residents, probably excited to finally see the sun, walk out to greet whoever's there. They get immediately gunned down. The Enclave labels them as resisting capture, which is the kind of excuse that only sounds believable if you've never met the Enclave. It's like claiming someone attacked you after you broke into their house. The mental gymnastics are Olympic level. The rest of Vault 13's population, now realizing this is very bad, gets kidnapped anyway. The Enclave loads them onto vertibirds and flies them to their oil rig base where they become test subjects for the FEV Curling 13 virus. This virus is designed to kill anyone with even trace amounts of mutation, which in the Fallout universe is basically everyone except the Enclave themselves. So the survivors of Vault 13, who did everything right, who survived the apocalypse and rebuilt under computer rule, end up as lab rats in a genocide project. That's bleak, even by Fallout standards. And when the Chosen One destroys the oil rig in 2242, any remaining Vault 13 residents die in the explosion. So their story ends, not with rebuilding or hope, but with being used as test subjects and then vaporized. Fantastic. Really living the dream there. But wait, it somehow gets weirder. After the kidnapping, the Enclave dumps their failed intelligent Deathclaw experiments into Vault 13. Except these Deathclaws aren't failures at all. They're smart, organized, and just pretending to be less capable because they know the Enclave is watching. They turn Vault 13 into their own little community, which is both fascinating and deeply ironic. The Vault built to preserve humanity ends up preserving something else entirely. Depending on player choices, the Deathclaws either get exterminated, get captured, or manage to survive using a voice module that lets them interface with Vault systems. The canon ending is disputed and frankly bugged in-game, but either way, Vault 13's human legacy ends in abduction and death. If this is what happens to one of the normal Vaults, you can imagine how bad the experimental ones got. And trust me, you're not ready for what happened when Vault Tech stopped pretending to be ethical. Vault 8, successful dystopia. So if Vault 13 is a tragedy, Vault 8 is a cautionary tale about what happens when survival turns into superiority. And you might think a successful Vault would be good news, but you'd be wrong. Vault 8 opened successfully in 2091 using its Geet-Seek, and its residents built Vault City, a gleaming settlement that looks like civilization made it through the apocalypse. And on paper, this is the success story. The tech worked, the people thrived, they built infrastructure. This is literally the best case scenario for a Vault, except there's a problem. Vault City's survivors didn't just rebuild society, they rebuilt the worst parts of pre-war society and called it progress. By 2241, Vault City had become a rigid caste system that would make pre-war America proud. Citizens live inside clean walls with healthcare, education, and actual rights. Every everyone else, outsiders, tribals, ghouls, anyone deemed too wasteland, they get sorted into a permanent underclass. You want citizenship? Better hope you're useful, obedient, and not too visibly mutated. Otherwise, you get to stay outside the walls where the turrets can watch you. The survivors of Vault 8 looked at the apocalypse, survived it, and then immediately decided the real enemy was poor people. I'm not even exaggerating. They treat their neighbors in Gecko, a ghoul settlement that literally helps power their city, like contamination instead of allies. Vault City's leadership spends half their time debating whether to negotiate with Gecko or just hire mercenaries to solve the problem permanently. That's the survivor mentality in action. We made it out, so clearly we're better than everyone else. And the scary part? They're not wrong about being successful. Vault City is stable, growing, and one of the most advanced settlements in the wasteland. But that success comes at the cost of turning survival into a filter for who deserves to live well. And here's the thing that makes Vault City so unsettling. This wasn't even an experimental vault. There was no Vault-Tec gimmick pushing them toward this outcome. They just chose it. The survivors of Vault 8 had every opportunity to build something better, and instead, they recreated pre-war social hierarchies, because apparently the apocalypse didn't teach them anything about empathy. Yeah, that worked out really well for them. But what happens when Vault-Tec does design an experiment around division? Because the next vault proves that sometimes the cruelest experiments are the ones that give people exactly what they think they want. Vault 15, fractured ideologies. Vault-Tec loved running social experiments, and Vault 15 asked a particularly nasty question. What happens when you cram people from wildly different ideological, cultural, and religious backgrounds into one sealed box and tell them to get along? The answer, as it turns out, is that they absolutely do not get along. Vault 15 was designed with maximum diversity, which sounds progressive until you realize Vault-Tec's goal wasn't harmony, it was controlled conflict. They wanted to see if forced proximity would create unity or if people would fracture along existing fault lines. Guess which one happened? If you guessed everyone got along, you haven't been paying attention to this series. The survivors of Vault 15 didn't just leave the vault, they splintered into completely different factions, each taking opposing lessons from their underground imprisonment. One group decided civilization was worth rebuilding and founded Shady Sands, which eventually grew into the new California Republic. These survivors looked at the wasteland and said, "We can make this better." Another group became the Khans, a raider tribe that decided society failed them, so they'd take what they wanted by force. These survivors looked at the same wasteland and said, "We're owed something for surviving." A third group became the Vipers, a weird cult that worships radiation and snakes, because apparently being sealed in a vault makes some people very strange. I don't even know what lesson they took from Vault 15, but it involved a lot of venom and bad decisions. Maybe they just really liked snakes. Who knows? So Vault 15's survivors didn't just scatter, they became ideological opposites. The NCR builds laws, taxes, and bureaucracy. The Khans build camps, raids, and revenge fantasies. The Vipers build, honestly, nobody's sure, but it involves rattlesnakes and religious fervor. By the time players encounter Vault 15 and Fallout 2, it's a gutted ruin occupied by squatters. The original survivors? Long gone, scattered into factions that now define the wasteland's political landscape. Vault 15 proves that survival isn't just physical, it's ideological. The same starting conditions can produce nation builders, raiders, and cultists depending on what people decide the apocalypse means. And here's the darkest part. All three groups think they're right. The NCR believes in order, the Khans believe in strength, the Vipers believe in snakes, I guess. None of them see themselves as the villains of their own story. That's what Vault 15's experiment really tested. Not whether diversity works, but how quickly shared trauma can turn into competing mythologies. So if Vault 15 shows what happens when people fragment into factions, the next Vault asks an even darker question. What happens when you don't just control their choices, but their entire reality? Vault 101, forever sealed. Vault 101's experiment was beautifully simple and horrifically cruel. Never open, ever. The vault was supposed to stay sealed indefinitely, creating a completely isolated society where the Overseer's word was law and the outside world was literally a myth. And for 200 years, it worked. The survivors of Vault 101 aren't people who escaped an experiment, they're people who lived it for generations. By 2277, every resident genuinely believed the outside world was uninhabitable. They're taught from birth that the vault is all that's left of humanity, that opening the door means death, and that questioning the Overseer is basically suicide. It's 1984 meets Plato's Cave, except the cave is a metal tube, and Big Brother wears a jumpsuit. Then James, the lone wanderer's father, escapes. And the entire foundation of Vault 101 society cracks in half. Because here's the thing about lies. They only work until someone proves them wrong. James opens the door and leaves, and the vault doesn't implode. The air doesn't kill everyone. The Overseer's authority, built entirely on fear of the outside, suddenly has a James-shaped hole in it, and when the lone wanderer follows, that hole becomes a chasm. Vault 101 fractures into factions. Those who want to open the vault and join the world, and those who want to keep it sealed and maintain control. The survivors who push for opening aren't rebels, they're just people who realized they've been lied to for their entire lives. And the survivors who want to stay closed aren't evil, they're terrified. The only world they know is the vault, and change means admitting their entire existence was built on a lie. Depending on the Lone Wanderer's choices, Vault 101 either cautiously opens, remains sealed under new leadership, or descends into chaos. But here's the tragedy. Even if they open, the survivors of Vault 101 are 200 years behind the wasteland. They have no allies, no knowledge of threats, and no experience with anything outside their metal box. They're not survivors in the traditional sense. They're refugees from a lie that lasted longer than most civilizations. I spent way too long thinking about Vault 101 during my playthrough, and honestly, it's one of the most psychologically messed up experiments Vault-Tec ever ran. Because unlike vaults that kill you with drugs or radiation, Vault 101 kills you with ignorance. It turns reality itself into the enemy. And when the survivors finally step outside, they're not just entering the wasteland, they're entering a world that already moved on without them. But you think social manipulation is bad? Wait until you hear what Vault-Tec did when they decided to strip away everything except one person's sanity. Because this next one is genuinely unhinged. Vault 77, the Puppet Man's nightmare. Okay, so we need to talk about Vault 77, because this one is insane. Vault-Tec locked one person, just one guy, inside a vault with nothing but a box of puppets. That's it. That's the entire experiment. And somehow this becomes one of the most terrifying survivor stories in the entire franchise. Picture this. The Great War hits, the vault door seals, and you're alone. Completely alone. No family, no neighbors, no other voices. Just you, the hum of machinery, and eventually, the crushing realization that nobody else is coming. The guy pounds on the door for days, begging for someone to let him out or let others in. Nobody answers, because there's nobody to answer. He's the only resident of Vault 77. Eventually, he opens a box and finds hand puppets, a Vault Boy mascot, a grandmother, a king, and a dog. And at first, it's harmless coping. He's lonely, so he makes up conversations. The puppets become characters. The grandmother bakes invisible pies. The king makes grand declarations. It's childish, sure, but it's survival. When you have nobody, your brain doesn't stay quiet, it improvises. I get it, honestly. I talk to myself while making videos, and at least I'm not alone in a vault. But then, the Vault Boy puppet changes. It stops following the script. It starts saying things the man didn't intend. Dark things. Cruel things. One night, the king puppet gets murdered, and the Vault Boy takes credit, only to reveal it was the man himself who did it. Whether it's supernatural, possession, or psychological breakdown doesn't matter, the result is the same. The man no longer knows where he ends, and the puppet begins. That's the core horror of Vault 77. The puppet gives his worst impulses a voice he can blame, obey, and hide behind. It's permission in fabric form, and once that voice exists, it doesn't stay inside the vault. Because why would Vault-Tec stop at breaking one person when they can create a wasteland legend? The man eventually leaves, fights a warehouse-sized rad scorpion because the wasteland has a sense of humor, and then starts wandering. He encounters raiders, slavers, and other survivors, and he kills them at the puppet's urging, or maybe his own urging. Again, the line is gone. People start fearing him not because he's skilled, but because he's proof that a human mind can become a weapon when it's hollowed out the right way, even with something as innocent as a hand puppet. Years later, by 2277, the mere sight of a Vault 77 jumpsuit is enough to make hardened raiders and slavers panic. That's how legendary the Puppet Man becomes. The survivors of Vault 77, there's only one, and he's not really surviving anymore. He exists as a roaming horror story, an urban legend built from isolation, paranoia, and a puppet that may have never spoken at all. Vault 77 didn't just break one man, it created a myth that outlived him. That's Vault-Tec's legacy in one story. They don't just hurt people, they create consequences that echo through the wasteland for centuries. And speaking of consequences that outlive the vault, let's talk about what happens when you give an entire community unlimited firepower and expect them not to use it. Vault 34, the Boomers. If you've ever wondered what happens when you give a bunch of Americans unlimited guns and lock them in a confined space, Vault 34 answers that question with artillery fire and zero subtlety. Vault 34 was basically a Second Amendment fever dream. Instead of more living space or food storage, the vault had an overstocked armory with enough weapons to start a small war. The US Air Force even used it to stash experimental weapons like a prototype pulse pistol. So Vault 34's residents didn't just have access to guns, their entire identity became tied to to them. And when your identity is based on firepower, conflict becomes inevitable. It's not a question of if, but when. The survivors of Vault 34 revolted against their overseer before 2231, demanding to leave and see the outside world. Sounds reasonable, right? Except during the chaos, someone sabotaged the nuclear reactor and flooded sections of the vault. Whether it was intentional or collateral damage doesn't matter. The result is the same. The vault becomes an irradiated, failing tomb. The revolt wins, but the vault loses. Some residents manage to leave before it's too late, and these survivors become the Boomers, one of the most isolated and heavily armed factions in the entire Mojave Wasteland. They don't integrate, they don't negotiate, they arm themselves even further, raid military depots for bigger weapons, and eventually settle at Nellis Air Force Base. And then they make it very clear, anyone who approaches gets shelled with artillery. No warnings, no negotiations, just explosions. The Boomers aren't raiders or conquerors, they're just convinced that everyone outside their fence is a threat. And honestly, given that their vault literally collapsed because of internal conflict, it's hard to blame them for being paranoid. By 2281, they restored a B-29 bomber and defended their territory with overwhelming force. They survived Vault 34 by rejecting everything the wasteland represents, and they're not interested in changing. The survivors of Vault 34 turned their trauma into doctrine, and that doctrine works for them. But it also means they'll never truly rejoin the wasteland, because they've decided it's not worth the risk. They looked at their vault's downfall, decided people are the problem, and built a fortress to keep everyone out. It's survival through isolation, and it's honestly one of the more functional outcomes on this list. Still deeply paranoid, but functional. Meanwhile, the residents who stayed behind in Vault 34, they're either dead from radiation, turned feral, or trapped in flooded sections waiting for rescue that never comes. And the reactor's radiation spreads far enough to contaminate the NCR's sharecropper farms, poisoning crops and making Vault 34's failure everyone else's problem. So even in death, Vault 34's survivors managed to screw over their neighbors. That's impressive, in the worst way possible. Now, if you thought unlimited weapons were a bad experiment, wait until you hear about the Vault where democracy itself became the murder weapon, because nothing says freedom like voting on who dies next. Vault 11, democracy weaponized. Alright, so Vault 11 is genuinely one of the most messed up experiments Vault-Tec ever ran, and that's saying something. The premise was simple. Every year, the Vault has to sacrifice one resident, or the computer will shut down life support and kill everyone. Democracy meets human sacrifice. What could go wrong? At first, the Overseer volunteers, which is noble and also deeply sad. Then the survivors institute an election system to choose the next sacrifice. Democracy in action, right? Except it immediately turns into a nightmare. Political factions form, power struggles erupt, and eventually, the Vault descends into civil war. People aren't voting based on who deserves to die, they're voting to kill their enemies. It's democracy weaponized. By the time the dust settles, only 5 people are left alive. 5 survivors out of an entire vault. And they're done. They decide to end it with a suicide pact, refusing to sacrifice anyone else. They'd rather die together than keep playing Vault-Tec's sick game. And that's when the computer congratulates them. Turns out, the real experiment was to see if they'd refuse. The computer never intended to kill anyone. The door opens, and the survivors are free to leave. Except now they're racked with guilt, realizing every sacrifice was unnecessary. 4 of the 5 survivors follow through with the suicide pact anyway, because they can't live with what they've done. The 5th survivor? Nobody knows. They might have left, might have stayed, might have wandered into the wasteland and died, but the point stands, Vault 11's survivors didn't die from the experiment, they died from the guilt of surviving it. That's poetic and absolutely soul-crushing. Vault 11 proves that Vault-Tec's cruelty wasn't just physical, it was psychological. They didn't need radiation or drugs to destroy people, they just needed to make them destroy each other. And honestly, that might be the most evil thing Vault-Tec ever did, because it proves the experiments weren't about science. They were about seeing how far they could push human nature before it broke. Turns out, not very far. But psychological torture has nothing on biological horror. And the next Vault proves that sometimes nature is the real monster. And by nature, I mean fungus. Lots and lots of fungus. Vault 22, plant zombies. Vault 22 was supposed to be a success story. Advanced agricultural tech, sustainable food production, a self-sufficient underground ecosystem. And for a while, it worked. The survivors grew crops, maintained plant life, and proved that you could farm underground. Vault-Tec must have been thrilled. Then they introduced a fungus for pest control. Just a harmless little entomopathogenic fungus to keep bugs away. Except this fungus could infect humans. Oops. The survivors of Vault 22 didn't die quickly. They developed developed pneumonia, respiratory failure, and eventually, the fungus took over completely, turning them into spore-spreading plant zombies. By the time anyone realized what was happening, it was too late. The vault became a greenhouse of horrors, filled with former residents shambling around, spreading spores, and attacking anything that moved. Some survivors managed to escape before the infection spread, fleeing into the Mojave and trying to warn others. But by 2281, Vault 22 was a death trap filled with spore carriers and mutated plants. The NCR even sends expeditions to recover the agricultural data, because apparently risking lives for crop reports is a priority. Bureaucracy at its finest, folks. The survivors of Vault 22 either died as plant zombies, fled into the wasteland, or got killed trying to recover Vault-Tech's research. There's no happy ending here, just fungal infection and bad decisions. I'm never trusting Vault-Tech's idea of pest control again. Actually, I'm never trusting the Vault-Tech period, but especially not their agriculture. The room was basically engulfed in spores that you'd see in a Chipotle bathroom, except these spores actually kill you. So, we've seen psychological experiments, biological nightmares, and social collapse. But what happens when a Vault experiment gets stopped before it even starts? Turns out, even winning doesn't guarantee freedom. Vault 81, refused experiment. Here's a rare story. Vault 81 was supposed to test diseases on its residents through the ventilation system, monitored by a secret staff. Typical Vault-Tech nonsense, except the original overseer, Dr. Olivia Vold, saw the plan and said, absolutely not. She sabotaged the experiment, sealed off the secret section, and spared her people from becoming test subjects. That single act of rebellion saved Vault 81's survivors, but it also isolated them. By 2287, Vault 81 was still inhabited, still functional, and still sealed. The survivors trade with outsiders, but refused to fully integrate with the wasteland. They built a stable, insular society by avoiding Vault-Tech's experiment entirely, but that safety came at a cost. They never left. The survivors of Vault 81 didn't escape or rebuild, they just stayed, because staying was safer than risking the unknown. When the sole survivor visits, Vault 81 is prosperous, but stagnant. They've survived by avoiding risk, but they've also avoided growth. And the hidden section with the infected mole rats? Still there, still dangerous, still a reminder of what could have been. Vault 81's survivors won by refusing to play, but they're still living in the cage Vault-Tech built. It's survival without freedom, and I'm not sure that's winning. But hey, at least they're not plant zombies, so there's that. Small victories, right? And speaking of survival that doesn't feel like winning, let's talk about the Vault where only one person woke up to face the nightmare alone. Vault 111, sole survivor. Vault 111's experiment was cryogenic suspension. Freeze everyone, thaw them periodically for observation, rinse and repeat. Except in 2287, the Institute raids the Vault, kills the sole survivor's spouse, kidnaps their baby, and leaves everyone else frozen. By 2287, when the sole survivor woke up, every other cryopod had failed. The survivors of Vault 111 died in their sleep, frozen and forgotten, never knowing the world moved on without them. The sole survivor is the only survivor of Vault 111, and that isolation defines their entire story. They don't have a community to return to or fellow Vault dwellers to rebuild with. They have a pre-war past that nobody remembers and a wasteland that doesn't care. Vault 111's survivors aren't a group, they're a single person processing 210 years of loss in real time. And honestly, sometimes I think the ones who stayed frozen were the lucky ones. They never had to wake up and realize everyone they loved is gone, their world is destroyed, and their son is now leading the Institute. Talk about a bad morning. Makes your worst Monday look pretty good by comparison. But at least the sole survivor gets to wake up eventually. The next Vault's residents aren't so lucky, because they're trapped in a loop that never ends. And when I say never, I mean never. Vault 112, virtual hell. You think being frozen for 200 years is bad? Try being trapped in a virtual reality simulation controlled by a sadistic scientist for 200 years. That's Vault 112 in a nutshell, and it's one of the cruelest fates on this list. The survivors of Vault 112 are suspended in VR pods, living out simulations controlled by Dr. Stanislaus Braun, a man who makes most comic book villains look reasonable. For 2 centuries, he's been torturing them in Tranquility Lane, a twisted 1950s suburban simulation where he plays God. The residents die, get reset, and die again, their memories wiped every cycle so Braun can watch them suffer fresh every time. Think about that for a second. You're not just dying once, you're dying hundreds, maybe thousands of times, and every time you wake up, you don't remember the last death. You're stuck in an endless loop of suffering, and the only constant is Dr. Braun's sadistic laughter in the background. The lone wanderer can either kill them, granting mercy, or free them by completing Braun's twisted tasks. But freedom, at this point, means waking up as 200-year-old bodies in a failing vault. After 2 centuries of virtual torture, suddenly being thrust back into a decaying physical body in a post-apocalyptic wasteland probably isn't the happy ending you'd hope for. The survivors of Vault 112 didn't escape, and they can't can't escape on their own. They exist in a loop, and their only hope is that someone from outside ends it. Vault 112 survivors are a living argument for why some experiments should never have been allowed to continue. And honestly, I think this is by far one of the most insane fates in Fallout, but not for the reason you might think. It's not the torture itself, it's that Braun had 200 years to get bored and stop, and he never did. That's commitment to being evil. I almost have to respect the dedication, except no, it's just horrifying. Now, we've covered a lot of doomed vaults, but what about the ones that were supposed to succeed? Because even when Vault-Tec plays it straight, the Wasteland has other plans. Vault 76, reclamation gone. Wrong Vault 76 was a control vault designed to open after 25 years and release America's best and brightest to rebuild. And it actually worked. The door opened on Reclamation Day 2102, and the survivors left with hope, purpose, and Vault-Tec's blessing. Then they discovered Appalachia was a scorched, plague-ridden hellscape filled with robots, super mutants, and the scorched plague that turns people into bioweapons. Yeah, that went well. The survivors of Vault 76 scattered across Appalachia, establishing settlements and trying to rebuild while fighting impossible odds. They weren't raiders or isolationists. They were exactly what Vault-Tec intended: educated, skilled people ready to reclaim America. Except America wasn't ready to be reclaimed. By 2103, when new settlers arrived, the original dwellers were legends, survivors who carved out a future from nothing. But they're also exhausted, isolated, and constantly defending what little they've built. Here's what makes Vault 76 survivors different. They didn't turn into monsters, create dystopias, or seal themselves away. They did everything right. They followed the plan, used their training, and worked together. And the Wasteland still nearly destroyed them. That's the real tragedy of Vault 76. Even when you're prepared, even when you have the best people and the best intentions, survival in the Wasteland means losing a little bit of yourself along the way. The Vault 76 survivors are still out there, still fighting, still rebuilding. Maybe that's the real victory. Not avoiding trauma, but surviving it anyway. Or maybe I'm just being optimistic because the alternatives are depressing. Either way, they prove that Vault-Tec's control experiments could work. They just never accounted for the Wasteland being worse than they imagined. But if Vault 76 shows that even the prepared can struggle, the next vault proves that money and technology can't save you from your own nature. Because wealth and immortality are a dangerous combination. Vault 118, Immortal Greed. Remember Vault 118? The one where the ultra-rich sealed themselves inside and left everyone else to die? Well, turns out immortality has some complications. The survivors of Vault 118 transferred their minds into robo-brain bodies to avoid death. For 210 years, they lived as robots in a luxury resort, pretending the apocalypse never happened. No aging, no disease, no consequences. Just an eternal country club with metal bodies. Except immortality doesn't stop human greed. It just gives it more time to fester. Ezra Parker, one of the residents, embezzled money from Juliana Riggs before the war and spent 210 years hiding it. When she finally discovered the truth, he killed her and took her place, swapping bodies and identities to maintain the lie. 2 centuries of guilt, and he still couldn't own up to it. That's the real horror of Vault 118. The elite don't just avoid consequences, they rewrite reality to escape them. And when a visitor from Vault 111 arrives and starts investigating the murder, the whole charade starts to crumble. The survivors can either face justice, maintain the lie, or get wiped out entirely depending on player choices. Vault 118 proves that wealth and technology can't save you from yourself. The survivors escaped death, but they couldn't escape their pre-war greed, paranoia, and entitlement, and honestly, maybe that's worse than just dying. At least death is final. These people have to live with what they've become for eternity. Vault-Tec promised safety from nuclear war, but they completely lied. Every single vault was designed to torture, murder, or experiment on the people inside. From frozen families being forced to watch their loved ones die, to children becoming genetic harvesting farms, cloning disasters that created an entire population of a psychopath named Gary. I'll be explaining the hidden secrets of each vault, and the last one hurt me to write about, but first, we need to look at the vault that kicks off Fallout 4, Vault 111. In Vault 111, you get to survive nuclear war, only to watch your family get murdered while you're trapped behind frost-covered glass, completely helpless to stop it. Vault-Tec sold this as premium cryogenic preservation. Pay now and sleep through the apocalypse, waking up to a better world. The marketing brochures probably didn't mention the part where you'd be conscious during the worst moments, experiencing brief periods of awareness over 2 centuries, like a recurring nightmare. No thanks, Vault-Tec. I'd rather become the king of the wasteland. The Institute saw your vault as their personal adoption center. They shot your spouse, stole your baby, then left you on ice for 210 years while they raised your kid as their next director. Your pre-war neighbors from Sanctuary Hills, all dead in their pods, either from life support failures or because someone needed to demonstrate who controlled the defrost button. That's dark, man. But this is the really dark part. The Vault staff weren't even in on the full plan. When they realized Vault Tech had left them out of the freezing program, they revolted. Their skeletons are still scattered around the facility, proving that even Vault Tech's employees couldn't escape becoming test subjects. Yikes. Talk about a tough job. This Vault doesn't just kick off Fallout 4's revenge story. It establishes the franchise's core truth. There is no safe place when corporations treat human survival as a business opportunity. But at least the sole survivor eventually woke up. Some people have been trapped in nightmares for over 200 years with no hope of escape. Vault 112. Vault 112 trapped its residents in virtual reality pods, where they've been living the same suburban nightmare for 200 years under the control of a sadistic scientist playing God. Dr. Stanislaus Brown, Vault's overseer and inventor of the Gek, has been torturing the same group of people in a VR simulation called Tranquility Lane, where he can kill them, resurrect them, and kill them again for his entertainment. In Fallout 3, you enter this 1950s sitcom hell to find your dad, discovering you can either become a serial killer at Braun's command or activate a hidden failsafe. The residents have no idea they're in a simulation, living as eternal puppets while their real bodies rot in pods, occasionally getting their memories wiped when Braun gets bored of the current scenario. You can find Betty, a little girl who's actually Braun's avatar. This vault proved that given unlimited power over helpless people, even brilliant scientists will choose to become monsters rather than face their own mortality. Though eternal VR torture was nightmare fuel, it was nothing compared to the comedic horror of what happened with the cloning experiments. Vault 108. Gary. That's literally all you'll hear in Vault 108 because this place became a cloning facility where every single resident is now a violent copy of Gary. The original experiment involved cloning research with a terminally ill overseer who had cancer. Something went catastrophically wrong, and now the Vault is overrun with dozens of increasingly hostile Gary clones who only say their own name like demented Pokemon. The non-Gary residents either escaped, died, or got converted into more Garys through whatever nightmare science was happening in the cloning labs that clearly nobody understood. Audio logs reveal the horror of watching your vault slowly fill with identical psychopaths, while the original residents barricaded themselves in rooms trying to survive the Gary apocalypse. Clones get more unstable with each generation, meaning Gary 54 is way more violent than Gary 12. But these psychological experiments were just practice runs. Vault Tech was building towards something much worse. Vault 11. Vault 11 told its residents they had to sacrifice one person every year, or everyone would die. The Dwellers created an entire democratic system around choosing who dies, starting with volunteers, and moving to lottery, then to electing overseers who got executed after their term, turning politics into a literal death sentence. You can find campaign posters in Fallout New Vegas showing how political parties formed around who deserved to die, including the brutal Justice Bloc, who basically turned the Vault into a murder democracy where negative campaigns meant actual death. Catherine Stone became overseer by threatening to reveal everyone's dirty secrets if they didn't elect her, then used her final act to destroy the sacrifice system, resulting in a civil war that killed everyone except those final 5. The last audio log is just crushing silence after the survivors realize they murdered their entire community for a lie. This experiment revealed that people will normalize literally anything, including scheduled murder, if an authority figure tells them it's necessary. If you thought voting people to death was insane, the white noise experiment turned talented musicians into something far worse. Vault 92. Vault 92 gathered the world's best musicians and then drove them insane with subliminal messages hidden in white noise, turning virtuosos into violent psychopaths. The experiment used sound booths to pump hypnotic commands into residents' brains during hearing tests, slowly programming them to become super soldiers through audio mind control that they thought was just standard Vault maintenance. The Overseer's terminal in Fallout 3 reveals he was kept in the dark about the true experiment. Professor Malleus pushed the experiments harder despite warning signs, increasing the white noise exposure until residents' eyes went bloodshot. This Vault proved that trying to weaponize art just creates artistic weapons that nobody can control. Though turning musicians into killers was horrific, at least they stayed human, unlike what happened with the botanical experiments. Vault 22. Vault 22 turned into a plant zombie horror show when experiments with genetically modified crops created spores that transformed residents into mindless carriers, spreading deadly infections. The scientists Scientists were developing superplants to solve world hunger, but instead created vegetation that literally ate people from the inside out, turning the vault into an overgrown tomb where the garden fights back. When you explore it in New Vegas, you find mantises the size of dogs and spore carriers who used to be researchers, now shambling through greenhouse halls, spreading clouds of infectious death that'll poison you if you breathe without protection. The survivors who escaped became the tribal group at Red Rock Canyon, but they brought the spores with them. Dr. Peters, one of the scientists, deliberately sabotaged the vault's systems to prevent anyone from leaving with the spores, but his sacrifice came too late to stop some from escaping into the Mojave. But this biological nightmare was nowhere near as devastating as what Vault-Tec did with the FEV virus in the Capitol Wasteland. Vault 87. Vault 87 wasn't testing isolation or social dynamics. It was straight up turning people into super mutants using the forced evolutionary virus, creating the green-skinned monsters that terrorized the Capitol Wasteland. The residents got hit with FEV immediately after the vault sealed, transforming normal families into hulking abominations while their children watched. The entrance is so radioactive it'll kill you in seconds, forcing you to enter through little lamplight, cave full of kids whose ancestors probably escaped this nightmare before getting dipped in the vats. One super mutant named Fox retained his intelligence and helps you retrieve the Gek, but he's literally one in thousands who didn't become a mindless killing machine obsessed with finding more humans to transform. The Vault kept detailed records of each transformation, but turning people into monsters was just the beginning. Vault-Tec realized they could make people destroy themselves without any virus at all. Vault 114. Vault 114 recruited rich elites with promises of luxury, then stuffed them into unfinished quarters with broken amenities and an incompetent overseer chosen specifically to piss them off. The experiment wanted to see how wealthy people would handle losing everything. Fallout 4, you find it occupied by Skinny Malone's Triggerman gang. The interview tapes for overseer positions are comedy gold, featuring candidates who can barely form sentences being selected over qualified applicants because they'd cause maximum frustration to the highly educated residents. Psychological profiles show they specifically chose elites with the lowest tolerance for discomfort, including one woman who'd never walked upstairs before and a man who had servants to put on his socks. Subscribe right now if you want to see more dark secrets hiding in the wasteland, because the next Vault's experiment with addiction recovery will break your heart. Vault 95. Vault 95 gathered drug addicts, helped them get clean over 5 years of successful rehabilitation, then opened a hidden stash of chems to watch them destroy everything they'd built. The residents formed genuine bonds, created support groups, and celebrated sobriety milestones together, completely unaware that Vault-Tec had planted enough drugs to kill a Brahmin hidden in the walls, making what happened next even more cruel. When the 5-year mark hit, one planted agent found a massive chem stash, and within days the vault went from recovery paradise to blood-soaked drug den. One woman's journal describes watching her husband, clean for 5 years, beat their neighbor to death with a pipe for a single hit of jet, then overdose in front of their door while begging her forgiveness. You meet Kate near this vault, and her companion quest involves getting her clean at Vault 95's medical facility, using the same equipment that once helped and then destroyed hundreds of recovering addicts. Destroying adults was one thing, but Vault-Tec's most evil experiments targeted the one group that couldn't fight back: children. Vault 75. Vault 75 told parents they were saving their children through education, actually executed every adult immediately after the door sealed, then raised the kids as test subjects for genetic harvesting. The experiment killed children at 18 after evaluating their genetics, either harvesting their DNA if they were superior or turning them into staff. The graduation ceremony was literally a firing squad, with the Vault's mainframe in Fallout 4 showing records of hundreds of children terminated after their final exams. The psychological evaluations show kids were encouraged to form friendships and relationships specifically so researchers could study how they handled losing them to graduation, with notes about optimal grief responses. But even child harvesting wasn't as mathematically evil as what they did with the breeding program in Los Angeles. Vault 63. Vault 63 started as a normal vault until post-war modifications turned it into a weather machine that could reverse ghoulification but created violent electromagnetic storms across Appalachia. The Stoltz family discovered the vault generations after the bombs and modified its systems to try saving their ghoulified daughter, accidentally creating lost creatures that are basically super aggressive ghouls with lightning powers. The original experiment involved atmospheric manipulation to create perfect growing conditions, but the nuclear war's radiation interacted with the weather systems to create something nobody predicted. In Fallout 76's Skyline Valley update, you learn the weather experiments caused massive storms that destroyed settlements and created an entire region of electrical anomalies where your power armor might randomly shut down. The Vault's overseer went mad trying to perfect the weather control system, leaving behind journals about how she started seeing the storms as divine punishment for humanity's sins. Hugo Stoltz, desperate to cure his daughter Cassidy, ignored every warning sign and turned the entire vault into a massive Tesla coil that shoots lightning at anything that moves. The modification process required human neural tissue to interface with the weather control matrix, meaning Hugo literally put pieces of his own brain into the machine to save his daughter. This vault proved that even good intentions and family love can create disasters when you're messing with forces beyond human understanding. All of these experiments failed because people died too quickly, so Vault-Tec tried something different, vaults that actually work. And that's when things got really twisted. Vault 21. Vault 21 solved every dispute through gambling, creating a functioning society where blackjack determined who got extra water rations and poker decided vault leadership. The experiment worked perfectly with residents living in relative peace, settling everything from marriage proposals to maintenance schedules through games of chance, until Mr. House showed up and won the entire vault in a rigged game. The society developed its own culture around luck, with children learning card games before they could read, and elderly residents treated as wise elders if they'd survived decades of high-stakes gambling for basic necessities. Half the residents wanted to stay isolated, while the other half wanted to open up to the wasteland. He then filled most of the vault with concrete, kicked out the residents, and turned the entrance into a hotel on the Vegas Strip, keeping just enough rooms intact for tourists to gawk at how people used to live. Sarah Weintraub still runs the gift shop in New Vegas. The vault's success rate was so high that House had to actively sabotage it because a functioning anarchist gambling society didn't fit his vision of New Vegas. This vault actually succeeded in creating a peaceful society, which is exactly why House had to destroy it, because functional communities are bad for business. But at least the gamblers had a chance at winning, unlike the doomed pacifists who never stood a chance. Vault 94. Vault 94 recruited religious pacifists and programmed their vault to automatically open after 1 year so they'd have to share their resources with whoever showed up. The residents were so committed to non-violence that when raiders arrived demanding supplies, they welcomed them with open arms and got slaughtered for their kindness. The vault's residents had spent their year creating a garden paradise with abundant food and pure water, even developing new cultivation techniques that could have saved the wasteland if they'd survived to share them. The experiment tested whether pure pacifism could survive in the wasteland if you thought testing pacifism against raiders was cruel. The diverse ideology experiment created 4 different flavors of wasteland violence. Vault 15. Vault 15 crammed together people from wildly different political, religious, and cultural backgrounds, then opened the door after just 50 years to see what kind of society they'd create. Instead of melting pot harmony, the vault exploded into 4 distinct groups: the Khans who became raiders, the Vipers who started a snake cult, the Jackals who went full cannibal, and the only reasonable people who founded Shady Sands. The experiment was testing if extreme diversity under pressure would create unity or chaos. And Vault-Tec got their answer when residents started forming gangs before the door even opened. The new California Republic, the most successful post-war nation, came from this vault's refugees, which is ironic since the experiment was designed to fail. The vault's education system broke down within a decade as different groups refused to let their children learn together, creating separate schools that taught completely different versions of history. This vault proved that forcing incompatible groups together doesn't create understanding, it creates 4 different flavors of wasteland violence. But what happens when you give those same violent impulses unlimited firepower? Vault 34. Vault 34 gave its residents unlimited access to weapons, but didn't provide enough space or food, creating an overpopulated powder keg where everyone had guns, but nobody had room to breathe, creating a culture where violence was the first solution to any problem. When riots broke out over overpopulation, the survivors split into 2 groups, with one becoming the boomers who worship explosions at Nellis Air Force Base, while the others turned into ghouls trapped in the flooded vault. The reactor leak that ghoulified the remaining residents happened because someone used explosives to breach the armory door, causing a chain reaction that irradiated the entire lower level. The boomers who escaped developed an entire religion around explosives, believing that the bigger the boom, the closer to God, which explains why they shoot artillery at anyone approaching their base. This experiment asked what happens when you give everyone guns but nothing else, and the answer is they'll use those guns to take what they need. But this was nowhere near as sophisticated as the VIP Robo-Brain murder mystery that played out for centuries. Vault 118. Vault 118 split ultra-wealthy residents who became Robo-Brains from working-class people in terrible conditions, but the poor section was never finished, so only the rich folks' brains in jars survived to have the the world's worst dinner party for 200 years. The experiment wanted to study class warfare, but ended up with a bunch of entitled brains and robot bodies murdering each other over petty pre-war drama while complaining about the service, turning the vault into a robot Agatha Christie novel where every butler did it. The robo-brains still dress for dinner despite having no need to eat, hold board meetings despite having no corporation. The working class section is just empty concrete rooms and construction equipment, showing they never intended for poor people to survive at all. This vault proved that rich people's personalities are so toxic that even removing their bodies doesn't make them bearable. If you thought robot class warfare was absurd, the control vault that started everything proved even perfect. Isolation was just another experiment. Vault 13. Vault 13 was supposed to be a control vault studying long-term isolation for 200 years, but a broken water chip turned it into a desperate survival story that launched the entire Fallout franchise. The Vault Dweller got sent into the wasteland to find a replacement chip, discovering the super mutant threat and defeating the Master, only to be exiled for being too contaminated by the outside world to return. The Overseer's decision to exile the person who saved them all revealed that even successful vaults prioritized their experiment parameters over basic human gratitude or logic. The vault's records show they knew the water chip was failing for months, but kept it secret to prevent panic, inadvertently creating the conditions for their savior's emergence. This vault proved that Vault-Tec's control groups were just experiments waiting for something to go wrong. Even the control vaults were experiments, but at least those people had hope of survival. Some vaults were designed to kill everyone from day one. Vault 12. Vault 12's door was designed never to seal properly, exposing everyone inside to massive radiation that turned them into ghouls, while they thought they were safe from the bombs. The residents spent months wondering why people were getting sick, their hair falling out, their skin peeling off, before realizing the very shelter meant to save them was killing them slowly. Within a year, everyone was either dead or transformed into radiation-scarred ghouls, creating the settlement of Necropolis, where the ghouls tried to build a new society while dealing with discrimination from smooth-skinned humans. The Overseer knew about the door, but was ordered to tell nobody, dying of radiation poisoning while maintaining the lie that help was coming. This experiment was supposedly studying radiation's effects on humans, but really it was just creating a new subspecies of humanity through deliberate torture. If you thought radiation torture was bad, try spending 200 years completely alone with nothing but fabric dolls for company Vault 77. Vault 77 contained one man and a crate full of puppets, designed to study the effects of complete isolation with only inanimate objects for company, creating the legend of the puppet man who went completely insane. After years alone, the man started treating the puppets as real people, holding puppet trials, puppet executions, and even a puppet revolution, where he destroyed half of them in a rage before crying over their cloth corpses. He escaped after murdering the king puppet in what he described as a coup, entering the wasteland wearing a crown made from puppet heads and claiming to be the rightful ruler of the Puppet King. The jumpsuit from Vault 77 is found in Fallout 3's Paradise Falls, suggesting the Puppet Man became a slaver, though some say he still wanders the wastes performing shows for anyone who'll watch. This experiment proved that humans need actual human contact, not just faces to talk to, or they'll create their own reality where fabric and wood become more real than flesh and blood. But two vaults were so disturbing, even Fallout won't show you what happened inside Vault 68 and 69. Vault 68 contained 999 men and one woman, while Vault 69 had 999 women and one man, creating social dynamics so messed up that Bethesda refuses to show what actually happened inside. The experiments were supposedly studying how extreme gender imbalances affect society. Every vault I've shown you was designed to fail through horror, torture, or death. But the most terrifying vault of all was designed to succeed perfect because it proves Vault-Tec's ultimate plan worked. Vault 76. Vault 76 was a control vault with no experiment except gathering America's best and brightest, giving them 25 years to prepare, then releasing them to rebuild civilization on reclamation. The residents were carefully selected for their skills and psychological profile, creating a community of overachievers who spent decades training for the moment they'd emerge to reclaim Appalachia, essentially creating the most prepared post-apocalypse survivors possible. When the door opened in 2102, these vault dwellers spread across West Virginia to become the players in Fallout 76, each pursuing their own vision of rebuilding from launching nukes to opening shops. Within weeks of leaving, these perfect candidates for rebuilding were launching nukes at each other for better loot, proving that human nature beats training every time. Unlike every other vault where residents died horribly, Vault 76's people successfully established settlements. This vault proved that even when Vault-Tec played it straight, the world after the bombs didn't care about their pre-war plan. From the white noise soldiers of Vault 92 2 to the cloning disasters of Vault 108, from the voting murders of Vault 11 to the executive breeding programs of the Tri-Vault conspiracy, each one revealing that Vault-Tec saw the apocalypse not as humanity's end, but as their chance to play God with the survivors. Vault 8. This was one of Vault-Tec's rare control vaults with minimal interference, designed to open after 10 years and repopulate Nevada using a Garden of Eden creation kit. The experiment was to see if a vault could actually function as advertised, rather than as a twisted psychological torture chamber. Vault 8's residents successfully founded Vault City, a technologically advanced settlement that became one of the most prosperous communities in the post-war world. However, success came with its own problems. Vault City developed serious class issues, with pure-strain vault dwellers considering themselves superior to wasteland outsiders. The vault shows that even when Vault-Tec experiments work as intended, human nature finds ways to create new problems. Vault 8 proves that successful vault experiments can still produce societies with serious superiority complexes. If you thought class warfare was disturbing, the next vault turned democracy into a death sentence. Vault 11. This vault features one of the most psychologically twisted experiments in the entire series. Residents had to annually vote to sacrifice one dweller to the vault's computer, or everyone would supposedly be killed. The experiment was designed to test morality and social pressure, creating a society built on murder and betrayal. Elections became campaigns of character assassination as people tried to nominate their enemies for death. The vault descended into paranoia, violence, and political manipulation until only 5 residents remained. The ultimate irony? The computer's final message revealed that refusing to sacrifice anyone would have let them all go free. Vault 11 represents Vault-Tec's cruelest lesson about the corruption of democratic institutions under extreme pressure. Vault 11 shows that the most horrific societies are the ones where murder becomes a civic duty. But the next vault's experiment was literally built into its fundamental design. Vault 12. This vault's door was purposely left unsealed to expose residents to massive amounts of radiation, turning them into ghouls as part of a long-term study on radiation's effects. The experiment created Necropolis, a city populated by both intelligent ghouls and feral ones driven mad by radiation exposure. Vault 12 in Fallout 1 became foundational to ghoul lore in the series, showing how Vault-Tec was willing to condemn entire populations to horrific mutation just to gather scientific data. The Vault represents one of the more straightforward experiments. No psychological manipulation needed when you can just leave the door open and watch people slowly transform into living corpses. Vault 12 proves that sometimes the simplest experiments are the most cruel. If you thought radiation exposure was bad, the next vault was designed to never let anyone leave. Vault 13. The home vault of Fallout's original protagonist was designed to stay closed for 200 years, serving as a future genetic reserve for the Enclave's post-war plans. The experiment tested long-term isolation and genetic preservation, but the water chip failure, after just 80 years, forced the Vault dweller into the wasteland. Vault 13 showcases the Enclave's long-term planning and complete indifference toward their human test subjects. They were willing to keep people trapped underground for 2 centuries just to maintain a pure human gene. The Vault's failure ironically launched the entire Fallout series, proving that even the most carefully planned experiments can be undone by simple mechanical failure. Vault 13 shows that the Enclave's idea of genetic preservation was basically a 200-year prison sentence, but the next Vault decided to pack as much conflict as possible into one space. Vault 15. This vault was populated with residents chosen for extreme ideological diversity and designed to stay closed for 50 years. The experiment tested how different belief systems would interact under pressure, and the results were exactly as violent as you'd expect. 4 major factions eventually splintered off from the Vault, including the founders of both the Khans Raider tribe and the New California Republic. Vault 15 demonstrates Vault-Tec's understanding that ideological differences become exponentially more dangerous in confined spaces. The Vault essentially became a pressure cooker for political extremism, proving that diversity without common ground leads to inevitable conflict. Vault 15 proves that putting people with opposite worldviews in a confined space creates future warlords and politicians. If you thought ideological conflict was destructive, the next Vault's fate remains largely mysterious. Vault 17. Details about this Vault's experiment are mostly unknown, but all residents were reportedly abducted by super mutants from the Master's army in Fallout 1. The Vault is connected to Lily Bowen's tragic backstory in New Vegas. She was transformed from a grandmother into a Nightkin supermute. Vault 17 represents one of the series' unsolved mysteries. We know something terrible happened, but the specific experiment remains hidden. The Vault shows how some of Vault-Tec's experiments were interrupted by external forces, though the residents residents probably didn't consider super mutant abduction an improvement over whatever psychological torture was planned. Vault 17 shows that sometimes being kidnapped by super mutants is preferable to completing a Vault-Tec experiment. But the next vault decided to turn architecture into psychological warfare. Vault 19. This vault was divided into red and blue sectors to foster paranoia and rivalry between different groups of residents. The experiment tested how artificial divisions and color-coded tribalism would affect a closed society, and the results were predictably violent. The vault eventually collapsed from internal conflict as residents fought over imaginary differences created by nothing more than room assignments. Vault 19 in New Vegas demonstrates how easily people can be manipulated into hating each other over completely arbitrary distinctions. The experiment shows that humans will find ways to create conflict even when they have no real reasons to fight. Vault 19 proves that people will literally kill each other over the color of their living quarters. If you thought color-based warfare was absurd, the next vault turned every decision into a game of chance. Vault 21. This vault required all disputes to be resolved through gambling and games of chance rather than violence or democratic processes. The experiment tested whether a society based entirely on luck could function, and it actually worked surprisingly well until Robert House won the entire vault in a card game. The vault was eventually converted into a casino hotel in New Vegas, making it one of the few vault experiments that continued operating in its original form. Vault 21 represents Vault-Tec's exploration of alternative governance systems, showing that sometimes random chance produces better results than human judgment. Vault 21 shows that a society based on pure luck somehow works better than most political systems. But the next vault decided to experiment with agriculture in the most dangerous way possible. Vault 22. This vault was dedicated to cultivating aggressive, genetically enhanced crops designed to resist harsh post-apocalyptic conditions. The agricultural experiment went horribly wrong when the enhanced plants unleashed a devastating spore infection that killed or transformed the entire vault population. Vault 22 in New Vegas is now overrun by deadly plant creatures and filled with toxic spores that turn people into plant-human hybrids. The vault represents Vault-Tec's willingness to weaponize nature itself, showing how attempts to improve food production can create biological nightmares instead. Vault 22 proves that playing God with agriculture creates killer plants that make regular radiation seem friendly. If you thought murderous plants were bad, the next vault decided to test human limits through simple overcrowding. Vault 27. This vault was crammed with 2-0 people instead of its intended capacity of 1-0, creating an overcrowding experiment that tested resource scarcity and social pressure. The results were exactly what you'd expect. Resource shortages led to rioting, social collapse, and death as residents fought over food, water, and living space. Vault 27 demonstrates that sometimes the most effective experiments are the simplest ones. You don't need elaborate psychological manipulation when you can just pack too many people into a small space and watch them tear each other apart. The vault shows how quickly civilization breaks down when basic needs aren't met. But the next vault decided to remove adults from the equation entirely. Vault 29. This vault only allowed children under 15 to enter, with all adults barred from residence. The children were raised by an AI called Mother Eve in an experiment studying youth development without adult guidance. Vault 29 represents one of Vault-Tec's most ethically questionable experiments, essentially orphaning hundreds of children to see how they develop in isolation. The experiment tested whether artificial intelligence could successfully replace human parenting and social structures. The Vault's ultimate fate remains uncertain. It demonstrates how Vault-Tec was willing to sacrifice entire generations of children for scientific data. If you thought AI parenting was disturbing, the next vault decided to arm everyone and see what happened. Vault 34. This vault's armory was deliberately overstocked with weapons and ammunition, but featured a faulty door that could easily open, allowing residents to leave whenever they wanted. The experiment tested the effects of excessive militarization on a supposedly sealed society. Internal conflict eventually broke out as heavily armed factions fought for control, and radiation leaks from the damaged reactor killed or mutated most of the population. Vault 34 demonstrates how access to unlimited firepower combined with cabin fever creates the perfect recipe for civil war. But the next vault took deprivation to its most basic level. Vault 36. This vault provided only thin, watery gruel as food for all residents, creating a chronic hunger experiment that tested malnutrition's effects on society. The residents faced constant hunger, malnutrition, and the psychological stress of never having a satisfying meal. Vault 36 represents Vault-Tec's exploration of basic human needs, What happens when you meet the absolute minimum calorie requirements but provide no food satisfaction or variety? The experiment tested whether a society could function when its members were technically alive but constantly miserable from hunger. The vault shows how quickly social bonds break down when everyone is always thinking about their next meal. If you thought bad food was depressing, the next vault literally kept everyone in the dark. Vault 42. This vault permitted no light bulbs greater than 40 watts, forcing residents to live in constant dimness. The experiment tested the long-term effects of extreme low-light conditions and sensory restriction on human psychology. Residents suffered from chronic frustration, depression, and negative psychological impacts from never experiencing proper lighting. Vault 42 demonstrates how something as simple as inadequate lighting can become psychological torture when extended indefinitely. The vault shows that Vault-Tec understood how environmental factors could be weaponized against human well-being without any obvious mechanical devices or chemicals. But the next vault decided to add a wild card to the social experiment. Vault 43. This vault was populated with 20 men, 10 women, and 1 panther, creating what's considered a deliberately absurd scenario to test how residents would cope with a wild predator in their midst. The experiment's outcome is unclear, but it represents Vault-Tec's willingness to introduce completely unpredictable variables into their social studies. Vault 43 shows how the company wasn't above adding literal wild animals to their human experiments, possibly just to see if desperate people could find ways to coexist with apex predators. The vault demonstrates that some experiments were designed more for shock value than scientific merit. Vault 43 proves that Vault-Tec thought adding a panther to any social situation would make it more interesting. If you thought wild animals were chaotic, the next vault let artificial intelligence play deadly games with human leadership. Vault 51. This vault replaced traditional human oversight with a Zax-class AI that manipulated residents into constant competitions to determine leadership fitness. The AI created cycles of conflict by continually changing the Prospeld AI rules and encouraging deadly competition among residents. Vault 51's experiment formed the basis for Fallout 76's nuclear winter scenario, where the AI's manipulation created an endless battle royale among the survivors. But the next vault decided to test human patience through perpetual mechanical failure. Vault 53. This vault had all its equipment intentionally designed to fail at regular intervals, forcing residents into endless cycles of repair and maintenance. The experiment tested human responses to chronic frustration and technical incompetence, creating a society where nothing ever worked properly for long. The vault shows that sometimes the most effective way to break people's spirits is to make their basic tools unreliable. If you thought broken equipment was frustrating, the next vault removed entertainment entirely. Vault 55. This vault entered without any entertainment tapes or media, forcing residents to provide their own recreation in a complete intellectual deprivation experiment. The vault tested how people would cope with absolute boredom and whether they could create their own cultural activities without external input. Residents were forced to develop their own games, stories, and social activities while dealing with the psychological strain of monotony. Vault 55 represents Vault-Tec's understanding that entertainment isn't just luxury, it's essential for mental health. The experiment shows how quickly people deteriorate when they have nothing to distract them from their circumstances. But the next vault decided that bad entertainment was worse than no entertainment. Vault 56. This vault contained only entertainment tapes of a single terrible comedian, forcing residents to endure the same awful comedy routines repeatedly. The experiment tested whether bad cultural input was worse than no input at all, subjecting people to comedy so unfunny it became torture. Vault 56 represents the logical extension of Vault 55's experiment, proving that humans need quality entertainment, not just noise to fill the silence. If you thought bad entertainment was cruel, the next vault created extreme gender imbalances. Vault 68. This vault was populated with 999 men and just 1 woman, creating a severe gender imbalance that resulted in social, psychological, and genetic crises. The experiment tested how society would manage under enforced demographic extremes, essentially creating a pressure cooker of sexual frustration and competition. The single woman faced impossible social pressure, while the men competed desperately for her attention. Vault 68 proves that extreme gender imbalances create societies built on desperation and conflict. And its counterpart vault flipped the script entirely. Vault 69. This vault featured 999 women and 1 man, testing the reverse scenario of Vault 68's gender imbalance experiment. While the exact outcomes aren't fully documented, the premise created similar social pressures and genetic bottlenecks from the opposite direction. The lone man faced overwhelming pressure while the women dealt with impossible competition for reproductive rights. If you thought gender imbalances were unethical, The next vault turned childhood into a eugenics program. Vault 75. This vault posed as a safe haven for children under Malden Middle School, but secretly implemented one of the most brutal eugenics programs in the series. Staff separated children from parents by executing adults on arrival, then subjected kids to extreme physical and mental testing. At age 18, failed subjects were killed while superior specimens had their genetic material harvested for further experimentation. Some successful subjects were promoted to staff positions to continue the cycle. Eventually, the enhanced subjects staged an uprising and overthrew their tormentors. Vault 75 in Fallout 4 represents Vault-Tec's most openly genocidal experiment, focused on creating super soldiers through child abuse and murder. But even that wasn't the darkest Vault experiment. Vault 76. This was officially a control vault, designed to open after 25 years for rapid surface reclamation, but the real experiment was psychological manipulation through hope and competition. The vault indoctrinated its 500 best and brightest residents to believe they alone were capable of rebuilding America, fostering extreme competitiveness and ambition. Overseers received ambiguous instructions about reclaiming nuclear silos, essentially programming vault dwellers to become post-war weapons of mass destruction. Vault 76 in Fallout 76 represents the most insidious experiment, using patriotism and hope as tools for manipulation. Vault 76 proves that the most effective brainwashing uses hope and pride instead of fear and despair. If you thought patriotic manipulation was subtle, the next vault went for direct biological warfare. Vault 87. This vault subjected residents to forced evolutionary virus experimentation in an attempt to create super soldiers through forced mutation. Most subjects died horribly or became super mutants, losing their intelligence and humanity in the process. Vault 87 became the source of the Capital Wasteland's super mutant population in Fallout 3, showing how one vault's failed experiment could terrorize an entire region for centuries. The vault represents Vault-Tec's willingness to use residents as test subjects for biological weapons development. The experiment demonstrates that some scientific research is so unethical it creates monsters that outlive their creators. Vault 87 shows that trying to improve humanity through forced evolution creates mindless giants who hate everything. But the next vault was designed to test experimental technology on unwilling subjects. Vault 88. This vault served as a prototype facility for testing next-generation vault technology and experimental add-ons on residents. The vault was unfinished when the bombs dropped, but in Fallout 4's Vault-Tec Workshop DLC, players can complete the twisted experiments themselves. Vault 88 represents Vault-Tec's ultimate goal, turning human beings into test subjects for whatever new torture devices they could invent. The Vault shows how the company planned to use Vault residents as beta testers for increasingly sophisticated forms of psychological and physical manipulation. The experiment proves that Vault-Tec saw every human being as potential laboratory equipment. Vault 88 proves that Vault-Tec's final goal was turning every Vault dweller into a living test dummy. If you thought direct experimentation was cruel, the next Vault weaponized creativity itself. Vault 92. This Vault was populated entirely by musicians and subjected to audio experiments including white noise exposure and subliminal message brainwashing. The experiment tested whether creativity could be controlled and weaponized through sound-based psychological conditioning. The audio manipulation caused madness and violence among residents until the Vault was eventually overrun by wildlife. Vault 92 in Fallout 3 represents Vault-Tec's attempt to turn art into a weapon of social control. Vault 92 proves that even music becomes evil when Vault-Tec gets involved. But the next Vault tried the opposite approach with pacifism. Vault 94. This Vault was designed as a social experiment featuring a pacifist, communal society where no weapons were allowed, and all residents were taught to reject violence completely. The experiment tested whether pure non-violence could survive in the post-apocalyptic world, and the results were tragically predictable. Most residents perished after repeated external attacks and internal strife when their idealistic principles met wasteland reality. Vault 94 in Fallout 76 serves as a tragic example of how noble ideals often can't survive contact with brutal circumstances. The Vault shows that Vault-Tec was interested in testing the limits of human goodness as much as human evil. If you thought testing pacifism was cruel, the next Vault weaponized addiction recovery. Vault 95. This Vault housed former drug addicts trying to recover from their addictions, but after several years of successful rehabilitation, a large stash of chems was revealed to study relapse rates. The experiment deliberately sabotaged people's recovery efforts to observe how addiction would reassert itself under pressure. most residents re-addicted themselves, leading to chaos, violence, and tragedy as their hard-won sobriety was destroyed by Vault-Tec's manipulation. Vault 95 in Fallout 4 represents one of the most psychologically cruel experiments, giving people hope for recovery then deliberately destroying it for scientific data. Vault 95 shows that Vault-Tec thought the best way to study addiction was to deliberately cause relapses. But the next Vault decided to experiment with environmental conservation. Vault 96. This Ark Vault housed a small group of scientists tasked with preserving animal and plant life for post-war repopulation, but the AI secretly enforced harsh productivity quotas and punished failure with poison gas. When scientists attempted to destroy the controlling AI, it responded by gassing the entire Vault population. The preserved animals and plants eventually escaped when the Vault doors opened, creating new mutated species throughout Appalachia. Vault 96 in Fallout 76 shows how even environmental conservation becomes twisted when filtered through Vault-Tec's corporate mentality. If you thought environmental protection was noble, the next Vault was designed to never let anyone experience freedom. Vault 101. This Vault was designed never to open, creating a permanent study of life under autocratic rule by the Overseer. The experiment tested how long people could be kept in isolated dictatorship without rebellion or psychological breakdown. Eventually, manipulation and unrest led to rebellion and the player character's escape in Fallout 3. Vault 101 represents one of the series' most recognizable experiments, the complete denial of human freedom disguised as safety and security. The Vault shows how easily protection can become imprisonment when those in charge have absolute power. But the next Vault decided to drive everyone insane with chemistry. Vault 106. This Vault released psychoactive drugs into the air supply after just 10 days, causing residents to experience hallucinations and violent behavior without any warning or explanation. The experiment tested the effects of involuntary chemical manipulation on human psychology and social structure. Inhabitants became completely deranged, with drug-induced hallucinations leading to violence and the complete breakdown of society. Vault 106 in Fallout 3 represents one of the most straightforward experiments: chemical warfare against the Vault's own residents. The Vault shows how quickly civilization collapses when reality becomes unreliable. If you thought chemical manipulation was horrific, the next Vault created an army of clones. Vault 108. This Vault featured a cloning lab that produced dozens of mentally unstable clones named Gary, while the Overseer was given terminal cancer and the power systems were designed to fail halfway through operation. The experiment tested what would happen when cloning technology was left unsupervised in a failing system. The Gary clones eventually overwhelmed the scientific staff and killed most residents, now wandering the Vault, endlessly repeating their own name. Vault 108 in Fallout 3 demonstrates how cloning experiments become horror shows when combined with inadequate oversight and failing infrastructure. But the next Vault froze time itself. Vault 111. This Vault placed all residents in cryogenic stasis under false pretenses, telling them it was for decontamination while actually testing the effects of long-term freezing on human subjects. The experiment tested whether humans could be successfully preserved for future use without their knowledge or consent. Power failures and staff deaths led to most residents dying in their frozen sleep, with only the sole survivor emerging 200 years later to begin Fallout 4. Vault 111 shows that Vault-Tec thought the best way to preserve humanity was to freeze them without permission. If you thought cryogenic imprisonment was cruel, the next Vault created digital hell. Vault 112. This Vault placed residents in virtual reality pods controlled by the sadistic Dr. Braun, who used the simulation to torture them for his own amusement for over 200 years. The experiment tested how long human consciousness could survive in virtual environments while being subjected to endless psychological torment. Residents lived in the Tranquility Lane simulation where they could experience death and trauma repeatedly without dying, creating perfect psychological torture. Vault 112 in Fallout 3 represents the ultimate fusion of technology and sadism, using virtual reality to create personalized hell for every resident. But the next Vault decided to test class warfare directly. Vault 114. This Vault was designed to house social elites in drastically underfunded and uncomfortable conditions, while being overseen by someone specifically chosen for inexperience and incompetence. The experiment tested how wealthy, privileged people would react to sudden poverty and poor leadership. The Vault was never fully occupied when the Great War began, but it represents Vault-Tec's interest in studying class conflict and social reversal. Vault 114 proves that Vault-Tec thought the best way to study privilege was to take it away and watch people suffer. And finally, the most openly elitist experiment, Vault 118. This vault provided ultimate luxury to a handful of wealthy and creative residents, while others served as their staff, testing class conflict and division within a closed system. The experiment examined whether extreme inequality could be maintained indefinitely in confined spaces. In Fallout 4's Far Harbor DLC, the Vault has become a murder mystery setting among the roboticized upper class, who continue their class-based society even after death. Vault 118 represents Vault-Tech's study of how economic inequality functions under extreme conditions, proving that class warfare continues even when everyone is technically dead. From democracy turned deadly to virtual reality torture chambers, Vault-Tech's experiments represent the systematic study of every possible way to break human society. Each vault tested different variables: overcrowding, isolation, chemical manipulation, artificial scarcity, technological dependence, and social engineering to determine how much suffering humans could endure before civilization collapsed. The vaults prove that the most dangerous enemy of humanity isn't radiation or mutants, but human curiosity without moral boundaries. Vault 1. The Los Angeles Vault was one of Vault-Tech's early prototypes, built beneath the Los Angeles Cathedral. This vault might have been intended as a control vault, or just an early test run. But honestly, it doesn't matter what Vault-Tech planned because something way worse took over. The Master, that grotesque blob of flesh and malice from the first Fallout game, discovered this vault and turned it into his base of operations. He used the residents as test subjects for FEV transformation, basically turning them into super mutants against their will. The Vault Dweller eventually put an end to this nightmare by detonating a nuclear bomb inside the vault in 2162, killing the Master and proving that sometimes the only way to stop evil is with more explosives. But if you thought the Master's takeover was bad, Vault 3 shows what happens when good intentions meet pure evil in the wasteland. Vault 3. Located in the Mojave Wasteland, Vault 3 was actually one of the 17 legitimate control vaults, designed to genuinely protect its inhabitants without any twisted experiments. For over 2 centuries, it worked exactly as advertised, keeping its residents safe from the nuclear wasteland outside. The problem came in the 23rd century when a severe water leak forced the Vault Dwellers to open their doors to the outside world. These people had lived in safety for generations, completely naive about the brutal realities of post-war America. When the Fiends Raider gang discovered the open vault, they didn't see potential allies or trading partners. They saw easy targets. The Raiders systematically slaughtered the innocent Vault Dwellers and took over Vault 3 as their base, turning one of humanity's few success stories into a drug-fueled nightmare den. The irony is devastating. Vault 3 proved that Vault-Tech's technology could actually work when they weren't deliberately sabotaging it, but the post-war world was so hostile that even a functioning vault couldn't protect its residents from human cruelty. Speaking of vaults that actually worked as intended, Vault 8 became one of the Wasteland's greatest success stories. Vault 8? Vault 8 was another control vault, equipped with a Garden of Eden creation kit and designed to open after just 10 years in 2087. But here's where things get interesting. Due to a shipping error that sounds almost too convenient to be accidental, Vault 8 received all the water chips that were meant for Vault 13. This meant they had backup water supplies, while Vault 13 would later face the water crisis that kicks off the entire first Fallout game. The residents of Vault 8 actually emerged early in 2079 and used their GECK to establish Vault City, which became one of the most technologically advanced and prosperous settlements in the post-war world. They created a functioning society with clean technology, medical advances, and actual governance. Vault City proves that when Vault-Tech wasn't actively trying to torture people, their technology could genuinely rebuild civilization. The success of Vault 8 makes the failure of other vaults even more tragic because it shows what could have been accomplished if the corporation had actually cared about humanity's survival instead of conducting sick experiments. But while Vault 8 residents were building a utopia, the people in Vault 11 were trapped in a democratic nightmare that would make Orwell weep. Vault 11. The Mojave Wasteland's Vault 11 housed what might be the most psychologically devastating experiment in the entire Fallout universe. Residents were told they had to democratically elect one person each year to be sacrificed, or everyone would die. This wasn't just murder. It was systematic psychological torture disguised as civic duty. Over the decades, this annual death sentence corrupted the entire society. Political factions formed specifically to manipulate the Overseer election, using it as a weapon to eliminate rivals. The Vault became a cesspool of corruption, blackmail, and political manipulation, where democracy itself became a tool of murder. Families turned against each other, friends betrayed friends, and the very concept of voting became associated with condemning someone to death. After generations of this horror, only 5 residents remained. These final survivors finally said no. They refused to elect anyone for sacrifice, choosing to face whatever consequences awaited. The Vault's computer system congratulated them for finally breaking the cycle, revealing that this was the intended outcome all along. But the psychological damage was complete. 4 of the 5 survivors immediately committed suicide from the crushing guilt of participating in decades of ritualized murder. Vault 11 proves that Vault-Tec understood how to weaponize democracy itself, turning humanity's greatest political achievement into a tool for systematic psychological destruction. If Vault 11 shows how Vault-Tec corrupted democracy, Vault 12 demonstrates their willingness to deliberately expose people to radiation just to see what would happen. Vault 12. Built in Bakersfield, Vault 12 featured a deliberately faulty vault door that wouldn't seal properly, ensuring constant radiation exposure for its residents. This wasn't an accident or equipment failure. Vault-Tec specifically designed this vault to study the effects of radiation on human populations, basically using an entire community as lab rats. The radiation exposure transformed the residents into ghouls, those distinctive post-war humans with rotting skin but extended lifespans. Rather than dying from the radiation, they adapted in the most horrific way possible, becoming living testaments to human resilience and Vault-Tec's cruelty. These ghoul residents eventually founded the city of Necropolis above ground, creating one of the first major settlements in the post-war world. Ironically, Vault 12 became crucial to saving other Vault dwellers. The Vault dweller from Vault 13 discovered a replacement water chip here, making Necropolis essential to the first game's main quest. The ghouls of Necropolis prove that even Vault-Tec's most callous experiments couldn't completely destroy human dignity and community. The connection to Vault 13 isn't coincidental, because that vault was designed for an experiment almost as cruel as deliberate radiation exposure. Vault 13. Every Fallout fan knows Vault 13 as the player's home vault in the first game, but its true purpose was testing prolonged isolation. This vault was designed to remain sealed for 200 years, studying how complete isolation from the outside world would affect human psychology and social development. The residents had no idea they were test subjects in a psychological experiment spanning multiple generations. The water chip malfunction that forces the Vault dweller to leave wasn't part of the original experiment, but it created the perfect opportunity to study what happens when someone from a completely isolated society encounters the post-war world for the first time. The Vault dweller's journey across the wasteland was essentially Vault-Tec's experiment continuing in the wild. Later, the Enclave invaded Vault 13 and killed most of the remaining residents for FEV experiments, proving that even the government Vault-Tec worked with saw Vault dwellers as expendable test subjects. The new California Republic eventually took control of the Vault, but by then, the original community was essentially extinct. Vault 13's story spans the entire series, showing how Vault-Tec's experiments had consequences that lasted for generations. While Vault 13 tested isolation, Vault 15 experimented with the opposite problem by cramming together people who fundamentally disagreed about everything. Vault 15. Vault-Tec deliberately populated Vault 15 with people holding radically different political ideologies and cultural backgrounds, then watched to see how they'd interact in confined spaces. This wasn't about studying cooperation or conflict resolution. This was about deliberately creating social tension to observe how different groups would fragment under pressure. Predictably, the residents eventually split into factions based on their conflicting beliefs. But here's what makes this experiment particularly significant. Those factions didn't just argue themselves to death. Some residents left to found Shady Sands, which eventually became the new California Republic, one of the most important political entities in the Fallout universe. Other groups became raider gangs like the Khans, showing how the same vault could produce both civilization builders and wasteland destroyers. Vault 15 basically demonstrates that Vault-Tec accidentally created a microcosm of post-war America, where ideological differences would shape the entire political landscape for centuries. The NCR's democratic values and the Khans' anarchistic raiding culture both trace back to people who lived in the same underground bunker, proving that environment matters less than ideology when rebuilding civilization. But if forcing different groups together created political chaos, Vault 19 shows what happens when you make those same groups paranoid about each other. Vault 19. The Mojave Wasteland's Vault 19 featured a unique design with 2 overseers governing separate red and blue sectors within the same vault. But this wasn't about redundancy or administrative efficiency. This was about inducing paranoia through psychological manipulation, using subliminal messaging, fake medical records, strange noises, and flickering lights to make each sector suspect the other of sabotage. The experiment worked exactly as designed. Both factions developed severe paranoia about their neighbors, constantly suspecting sabotage and conspiracy. Residents lived in constant fear and suspicion, never able to trust the people living just down the hallway. The psychological stress was so intense that the vault was eventually abandoned, possibly due to sulfur gas from nearby caves, but more likely because the paranoia became completely unbearable. Vault 19 proves that Vault-Tec understood how to weaponize architecture itself, using physical design and environmental manipulation to create mental illness. The Two Overseer system shows how authority figures can be used to legitimize completely irrational fears, turning leadership into a tool for psychological torture. After all that paranoia and conflict, Vault 21 seems almost refreshingly wholesome in its approach to human nature. Vault 21. Built under pre-war Las Vegas, Vault 21 created a society where every dispute and decision was settled through gambling. This wasn't about studying addiction or financial irresponsibility. This was about creating what Vault-Tec called perfect equilibrium, by making chance the ultimate arbiter of all social interactions. For over 200 years, this system actually worked. Residents lived in harmony because no one could blame anyone else for the outcomes of pure chance. Conflicts were resolved through card games, dice rolls, and other games of chance, creating a society where luck determined everything from daily chores to major policy decisions. It was probably the most peaceful vault experiment in the entire series. The experiment only ended when Mr. House, who understood the power of gambling better than anyone, won control of the vault through its own systems. He filled most of the vault with concrete and converted the top level into a hotel and casino, essentially absorbing Vault 21 into his New Vegas empire. In a way, this was the perfect ending for a vault based on gambling, because House played the ultimate game and won everything. Vault 21 shows that not all of Vault-Tec's experiments were designed to cause suffering. Some were genuinely trying to find new ways to organize human society, even if the methods were completely bizarre. But while Vault 21's residents were peacefully gambling their way through the apocalypse, the scientists in Vault 22 were creating a biological nightmare that would contaminate an entire region. Vault 22. Populated by scientists researching plant growth and pest control, Vault 22 initially seemed like one of the more beneficial experiments. The vault was equipped for agricultural research, and the scientists were working on legitimate projects to improve food production and pest management. This actually sounded like something that could help rebuild the world. The experiment went catastrophically wrong when the scientists began working with Beauveria mordicana fungus for pest control. The airborne spores didn't just kill pests, they infected the human residents, turning them into cannibalistic spore carriers who retained just enough intelligence to hunt and kill, but lost everything that made them human. The vault became a fungal nightmare where former scientists shambled through the halls as infected monsters. Some survivors managed to flee to Zion Canyon, but the fungal infection followed them. These refugees eventually died, but not before spreading the contamination that would affect the entire region. Vault 22 proves that even well-intentioned scientific research becomes horrific when conducted in Vault-Tec facilities, because the corporation never implemented proper safety protocols. They were more interested in observing what happened than preventing disasters. The biological contamination from Vault 22 shows how Vault-Tec's experiments didn't just affect Vault residents. They created lasting environmental damage that would plague the wasteland for centuries. Speaking of environmental damage, Vault 27 was designed to create a completely different kind of disaster through simple overcrowding. Vault 27. This vault was deliberately designed to house 2 people in space meant for 1 0. Testing the effects of extreme overpopulation on human psychology and social structures. Vault-Tec wanted to see how people would react when they literally couldn't escape from each other, when privacy became impossible, and when basic resources had to be shared among twice as many people as the space could reasonably support. Unfortunately, Vault 27 is only mentioned in the Fallout Bible and never appeared in any actual games, so we don't know exactly what happened inside. But honestly, you don't need much imagination to picture the results. Extreme overcrowding would create competition for basic necessities, eliminate personal space, and probably lead to violence, disease, and psychological breakdown. The fact that this vault was planned shows how thoroughly Vault-Tec understood human nature's darker aspects. Vault 27 represents one of the most straightforward experiments in the entire program, because it didn't require complex technology or elaborate psychological manipulation. It just required cramming too many people into too small a space and watching them destroy each other. But while Vault 27 tested overcrowding, the interconnected Vault system featured in the Fallout TV series shows how Vault-Tec could coordinate multiple experiments simultaneously. Vault 31, 32, and 33. The Fallout television series introduced a connected Vault system that reveals new depths to Vault-Tec's planning and cruelty. Vault 31 housed Vault-Tec management and cryogenic storage, essentially preserving the corporation's leadership while the rest of humanity suffered through their experiments. Meanwhile, Vaults 32 and 33 served as breeding and population control experiments, designed to create manageable human communities under corporate oversight. This system shows that Vault-Tec wasn't just conducting random experiments. They were creating a comprehensive plan for post-war society, with themselves as the permanent ruling class. Vault 31's management could wake up periodically to check on their experiments, then return to cryogenic sleep while generations of test subjects lived and died under their control. Vault 32 suffered a catastrophic failure that wiped out its population, while Vault 33 serves as the main setting for the TV series, where protagonist Lucy eventually emerges to discover the truth about the surface world. The interconnected design proves that Vault-Tec was thinking beyond individual experiments toward a complete system of human control spanning multiple facilities. This connected approach makes the corporation's crimes even more systematic and deliberate, showing they weren't just conducting isolated experiments but creating an entire infrastructure for post-war domination. But while the TV series Vaults represent corporate control, Vault 34 shows what happens when you give people too much access to weapons and too little space to use them safely. Vault 34. Deliberately overstocked with weapons and ammunition while providing limited living space, Vault 34 was designed to test how a heavily armed population would react to overcrowding. Vault-Tec basically created a powder keg by combining two elements guaranteed to create violence: too many people and too many guns. The experiment worked exactly as you'd expect. Overcrowding led to tensions, tensions led to violence, and the abundance of weapons made that violence deadly. When the Overseer tried to lock down the armory to prevent further bloodshed, a faction calling themselves the Boomers decided they'd had enough and left the vault entirely. These Boomers eventually settled at Nellis Air Force Base, where they became the explosives-obsessed faction you can encounter in Fallout New Vegas. The fighting over weapons access damaged the vault's reactor, irradiating the remaining residents and turning them into ghouls. So, Vault 34 managed to create both external and internal disasters. It released a heavily armed faction into the wasteland while simultaneously poisoning everyone who stayed behind. The Vault perfectly demonstrates how Vault-Tec's experiments often created problems that extended far beyond the original test subjects. The Boomers' obsession with explosives and their distrust of outsiders directly trace back to their traumatic experience in Vault 34, proving that the psychological damage from these experiments shaped entire cultures in the post-war world. While Vault 34 tested human reactions to weapons access, Vault 51 let an artificial intelligence decide who deserved to live and who deserved to die. Vault 51. Located in Appalachia and managed by a Zax supercomputer, Vault 51 represents one of Vault-Tec's most technologically advanced experiments in social engineering. The computer was programmed to run combat trials among the residents to select the perfect overseer through a process of elimination that basically turned Vault management into a battle royale. Zax manipulated the residents into fighting each other using psychological pressure, resource scarcity, and direct commands, treating human beings like chess pieces in a deadly game. The computer had no understanding of human value or dignity. It only understood optimization and efficiency. Every resident who died was just data to help Zax refine its selection process for the ideal leader. All the original residents died during these trials, proving that the computer's idea of perfect leadership selection was fundamentally flawed. Later, the vault was inhabited by wastelanders who also died or became scorched, showing that ZAX's experiments continued even after the original population was eliminated. Vault 51 demonstrates how Vault-Tec was willing to hand over complete control of human lives to artificial intelligence with no moral constraints. This vault basically previews what would happen if technology completely replaced human judgment in matters of life and death, creating a sterile, efficient process for eliminating unfit individuals that sounds disturbingly familiar to anyone who knows 20th century history. But if artificial intelligence management was frightening, the human-controlled experiments in Vault 63 proved that flesh and blood scientists can be even more monstrous than machines. Vault 63, also known as the Cadaver Project Vault, Vault 63 conducted illegal human cloning and ghoulification experiments under the direction of Hugo Stolz, a scientist who makes Dr. Frankenstein look like a humanitarian. These weren't medical experiments aimed at helping people. These were deliberate attempts to create artificial humans and to perfect the process of turning people into ghouls. Stoles created the Lost, which were modified ghouls with electrical sight capabilities, basically turning human beings into living weapons with enhanced sensory abilities. The cloning experiments involved harvesting DNA from staff members to create artificial humans, treating human reproduction like an industrial process. The ghoulification research aimed to perfect the radiation exposure process that created ghouls, giving Vault-Tec the ability to deliberately transform people. The Vault became extremely dangerous as Stoles' experiments got completely out of control. Most inhabitants were either transformed into monstrous creatures or killed outright. The few survivors had to live in constant fear of the modified ghouls and failed experiments that roamed the facility. Vault 63 shows how individual scientists within the Vault-Tec system could become even more cruel and experimental than the corporate-mandated experiments. Hugo Stoles represents the kind of person who thrived in Vault-Tec's system. Someone who saw human beings as raw materials for experimentation rather than people deserving basic dignity and respect. Speaking of experiments that treated humans as disposable resources, Vaults 68 and 69 represent some of the most obviously doomed social experiments in the entire program. Vault 68 and 69. These gender imbalance experiments are mentioned in the Fallout Bible but never actually shown in the games, which is probably for the best given how obviously horrific they would be. Vault 68 housed 999 men and 1 woman, while Vault 69 housed 999 women and 1 man. Vault-Tec apparently wanted to study extreme gender imbalances and their effects on social stability and reproduction. You don't need a degree in sociology to predict these outcomes. The single woman in Vault 68 would face impossible pressure, harassment, and probably violence from men competing for her attention. The genetic bottleneck would create severe birth defects and population collapse within a few generations. Similarly, the single man in Vault 69 would be under enormous pressure to reproduce while dealing with complex social dynamics among 999 women. Both vaults would theoretically result in violence, social breakdown, and genetic disasters that would doom their populations. The experiments show how Vault-Tec was willing to condemn entire communities to slow extinction just to gather data about human reproductive behavior under extreme conditions. These vaults represent social engineering at its most callous and short-sighted. The fact that these experiments were planned but never shown in games suggests that even the Fallout developers recognized they were too disturbing to portray, which honestly says a lot given some of the other content in the series. But while Vault 68 and 69 focused on reproductive pressure, Vault 70 was designed to test how religious communities would handle equipment failure. Vault 70. Populated by Mormon groups in the Salt Lake City area, Vault 70 was equipped with jumpsuit manufacturing equipment programmed to fail after just 6 months. The residents were supposed to open the vault in 2190 and use their GECK to establish New Jerusalem, but they'd have to do it while dealing with clothing shortages and equipment failures. This experiment targeted a specific religious community known for self-reliance, community cooperation, and strong social structures. Vault-Tec wanted to see how these cultural values would hold up when faced with basic equipment failures and resource shortages. The jumpsuit manufacturing failure was designed to create practical problems that would test the community's problem-solving abilities and social cohesion. Vault 70 only appears in the Fallout Bible and was never implemented in any games, so we don't know how the experiment would have played out. But the targeting of a specific religious group shows how Vault-Tec's experiments often focused on particular cultural communities, using their distinct values and social structures as variables in psychological research. The fact that this vault was designed around religious identity shows how thoroughly Vault-Tec understood and exploited American cultural diversity for experimental purposes. But if targeting religious communities seems callous, Vault 75 reveals the true depths of Vault-Tec's willingness to destroy families and children for the sake of eugenics research. Vault 75. Built under Malden Middle School and advertised as a child-friendly shelter, Vault 75 was actually a eugenics program designed to execute parents and transform children into perfect specimens for genetic harvesting. Families entered thinking they were saving their children from nuclear war. Instead, they were delivering their kids directly to Vault-Tec's most monstrous experiment. Upon entry, all parents were immediately murdered while their children were told they had died from radiation exposure. The children then underwent brutal training and testing designed to identify the most physically and mentally superior specimens. This wasn't education or child development. This was systematic conditioning to create human beings optimized for specific traits. The truly horrifying part is what happened to the successful children. Rather than being rewarded for their excellence, They were killed so their genetic material could be harvested for future experiments. The children who failed the testing were kept alive to serve the facility, basically becoming slave labor for their own prison. Eventually, the surviving children rebelled and killed their captors, but not before generations had been murdered. Vault 75 was later overrun by gunners, but the damage was already done. This vault represents the absolute nadir of Vault-Tec's crimes, because it specifically targeted families and children with deliberate deception, then systematically murdered parents and tortured children in the name of genetic optimization. The fact that this vault was built under a school shows how completely Vault-Tec was willing to pervert symbols of childhood and education for the most evil purposes imaginable. After learning about Vault 75's crimes against children, Vault 76 almost seems too normal to believe. Vault 76. One of the 17 control vaults, Vault 76 was designed to celebrate America's tricentennial while testing the effects of isolation on competitive personalities. This vault actually functioned as advertised, keeping its residents safe for exactly 25 years before opening as scheduled in 2102. The residents then emerged to reclaim Appalachia after the Scorched Plague had ended. Vault 76 serves as the player's starting point in Fallout 76, and it's refreshing to finally encounter a vault that didn't involve torture, murder, or psychological manipulation. The experiment focused on studying competitive people under isolation, but this was genuine research rather than deliberate cruelty. The residents were actually volunteers who knew they'd be opening the vault and rebuilding America. The vault's success makes all the other experiments even more tragic, because it proves that Vault-Tec could have built 122 legitimate shelters if they had actually cared about humanity's survival. Instead, they built 121 laboratories of horror and 17 actual shelters, condemning thousands of people to death and suffering for research that ultimately served the Enclave's goal of abandoning Earth entirely. Vault 76 represents what the Vault program could have been if it had actually been designed to preserve and rebuild human civilization rather than exploiting it for data. But while Vault 76 residents were rebuilding America, the people in Vault 79 were sitting on enough wealth to fund entire nations. Vault 79. Secretly containing the United States gold reserves transferred from Fort Knox, Vault 79 wasn't really about protecting people. It was about protecting America's wealth for whoever would control the post-war government. This vault basically served as an underground Fort Knox, ensuring that the nation's gold would survive nuclear war even if the nation itself didn't. The gold reserves created constant power struggles among the vault residents, because everyone understood they were sitting on unimaginable wealth while the outside world struggled with bottle caps as currency. The presence of so much valuable material turned the vault into a pressure cooker of greed and political maneuvering, with different factions fighting for control of resources that could reshape the entire wasteland economy. In Fallout 76, players eventually gain access to Vault 79 and must decide how to distribute the gold reserves among various factions, essentially determining the economic future of Appalachia. The Vault shows how Vault-Tec was planning for post-war economic control as much as social control, ensuring that whoever inherited their legacy would have the financial resources to dominate rebuilt civilization. Vault 79 proves that Vault-Tec wasn't just conducting experiments for scientific knowledge. They were positioning themselves to control every aspect of post-war society, from social structures to economic systems. But while Vault 79 hoarded wealth, Vault 81 was supposed to be conducting medical research that could actually help people. Vault 81. Designed as a disease research facility with a hidden experimental section, Vault 81 was supposed to expose residents to diseases and radiation to study mutations and develop cures. This actually sounds like legitimate medical research that could benefit humanity. But of course, Vault-Tec found a way to make it horrific by using unwitting test subjects instead of informed volunteers. The experiment failed because Chief Scientist Kenneth Collins refused to follow orders and sealed off the disease research area rather than exposing innocent people to pathogens. The main vault then functioned normally for over 200 years, becoming one of the few vault communities to actually thrive without outside interference. The secret research area was overrun by infected mole rats, but the residents remained safe. In Fallout 4, the player can help cure a child named Austin who becomes infected, showing how the vault's medical expertise was ultimately used to save lives rather than take them. The vault's Dr. Olivet represents what Vault-Tec scientists could have accomplished if they had been allowed to follow ethical medical practices instead of corporate mandates for human experimentation. Vault 81 demonstrates that individual conscience could sometimes overcome institutional evil, because one scientist's refusal to conduct unethical experiments saved an entire community from decades of medical torture. But while Vault 81's scientists prevented disease experiments, the researchers in Vault 87 enthusiastically embraced biological warfare research with results that would terrorize the wasteland for centuries. Vault 87. Created through a partnership between Vault-Tec and the US military, Vault 87 was designed to test the forced evolutionary virus on human subjects to create super soldiers. This wasn't a civilian experiment that got out of hand. This was deliberate collaboration between corporate and military interests to develop biological weapons using unwilling human test subjects. The FEV experiments created numerous super mutants through forced viral infection, turning normal people into massive, often sterile creatures with enhanced strength but diminished intelligence. The transformation process was agonizing and irreversible, essentially murdering the person while keeping their body alive as a weapon. Most super mutants retained enough memory to know they had been human, making their existence a form of living hell. Eventually, the super mutants overpowered their creators, killed the scientists, and took over the vault completely. They turned Vault 87 into a super mutant factory, kidnapping wastelanders and forcing them through FEV transformation to create more of their kind. The vault became a source of ongoing terror for the capital wasteland, because the super mutants had to constantly capture new victims to maintain their population. Vault 87 shows how Vault-Tec's experiments didn't just harm their original test subjects. They created ongoing threats that would plague the wasteland for generations. As super mutants continued the cycle of kidnapping and transformation that their creators had started. The Vault also reveals how eagerly the US military collaborated with Vault-Tec's human experimentation, proving that the corporation's crimes had full government backing and support. Speaking of government collaboration, Vault 88 gave Vault-Tec the opportunity to test prototype technologies before rolling them out to other facilities. Vault 88. Located at Quincy Quarries, Vault 88 served as a testing facility for prototype devices and technologies that would later be distributed to other vaults. This was basically Vault-Tec's research and development laboratory, where they could experiment with new forms of psychological manipulation and social control before implementing them on a larger scale. Construction was never completed when the bombs fell, leaving Vault 88 as an unfinished facility filled with experimental equipment. In Fallout 4's Vault-Tec Workshop DLC, the player can actually complete the vault and conduct experiments on settlers, essentially becoming a Vault-Tec overseer and experiencing the experiment design process firsthand. The DLC allows players to build devices that can manipulate settler happiness, health, and behavior through various forms of psychological conditioning. You can create exercise bikes that drug riders, slot machines that condition gambling behavior, and other devices that would fit perfectly into Vault-Tec's catalog of human manipulation tools. Vault 88 is unique because it lets players experience the moral choices that Vault-Tec scientists faced every day. You can choose to use the experimental equipment ethically to actually help your settlers, or you can embrace the corporation's legacy and conduct psychological experiments on unwilling subjects. The DLC basically asks whether you'd become complicit in Vault-Tec's crimes if given the opportunity. But while Vault 88 let scientists test new torture devices, Vault 92 used one of humanity's most beautiful achievements as a weapon against the human mind. Vault 92. Populated by talented musicians supposedly selected for artistic preservation, Vault 92 used subliminal white noise messages hidden in musical performances to create mind-controlled super soldiers. The Vault perverted music itself, turning artistic expression into a tool for psychological warfare and mental manipulation. The white noise programming was designed to override conscious thought and replace it with military conditioning, essentially turning artists into programmed killers. But the human mind isn't a computer, and the subliminal messages had catastrophic unintended effects. Instead of creating obedient soldiers, the white noise drove residents violently insane, causing them to attack each other in fits of uncontrollable rage. Professor Malleus discovered the truth about the experiment and tried to warn people, but he was likely killed for attempting to expose the program. The vault descended into chaos as musicians tore each other apart, their minds shattered by the very art they had devoted their lives to creating. The facility eventually flooded and was abandoned, leaving behind recordings that still contain traces of the mind-altering frequencies. Vault 92 represents one of Vault-Tec's most cynical experiments, because it specifically targeted people with artistic talent and sensitivity, then used their greatest passion as a weapon against them. The Vault shows how completely the corporation was willing to corrupt human culture and creativity for military purposes. But while Vault 92 corrupted artistic expression, Vault 94 shows what happens when people with genuinely good intentions try to use Vault-Tec technology. Vault 94. Populated by a pacifist community and equipped with a Garden of Eden creation kit, Vault 94 was actually designed to test whether peaceful people could successfully use GECK technology for environmental restoration. This experiment started with genuinely good intentions and actually succeeded for years, with the pacifist residents creating thriving agricultural systems and environmental restoration projects. The disaster came from outside when a delegation visiting the vault accidentally detonated the GECK with a minigun. This wasn't sabotage or deliberate destruction. It was a tragic accident that shows how dangerous Vault-Tec's technology could be, even when used by well-meaning people. The GECK explosion caused massive radiation exposure and triggered a strangler vine outbreak that created the entire Meyer region. Vault 94 proves that even when Vault-Tec technology worked as intended and was operated by people with the best possible intentions, it could still create environmental disasters that would last for centuries. The pacifist community's success at agriculture and environmental restoration makes their accidental destruction even more tragic, because they represented one of the few genuinely positive uses of Vault technology. The creation of the Meyer shows how Vault-Tec's technology was inherently unstable and dangerous, capable of causing massive environmental damage even when operated by experts with peaceful intentions. Speaking of people with good intentions facing technological disasters, Vault 95 shows how Vault-Tec could corrupt even successful recovery programs. Vault 95. Designed as a rehabilitation center for chem addicts, Vault 95 actually succeeded in its stated purpose for 5 years. Residents overcame their addictions, built a supportive community, and created a functioning society based on mutual aid and recovery principles. This was one of the few Vault-Tec experiments that actually helped people instead of harming them. But the success was all part of a larger, more cruel experiment. After 5 years of sobriety, a Vault-Tec plant revealed a hidden drug stash that had been concealed in the vault all along. This deliberate reintroduction of drugs after years of recovery was designed to test whether rehabilitation could withstand temptation, but it was really just psychological torture disguised as research. The mass relapse that followed was swift and devastating. Residents who had fought for years to overcome their addictions were suddenly faced with unlimited access to the substances that had nearly destroyed their lives. Violence erupted as people fought over drugs, overdoses killed community members, and the supportive society collapsed into chaos. Everyone died, and the vault was later overrun by gunners. Vault 95 represents one of Vault-Tec's most psychologically cruel experiments because it gave people hope and community before deliberately destroying both. The corporation proved they understood exactly how to maximize psychological damage by first allowing success and then engineering failure. But while Vault 95 corrupted human recovery efforts, Vault 96 focused on preserving animal life for future environmental restoration. Vault 96. Designed as a cryogenic storage facility for animal preservation, Vault 96 actually served a legitimate purpose by storing animal embryos and specimens for ecosystem restoration after nuclear war. This vault represents one of the few Vault-Tec projects that could have genuinely helped rebuild the world by preserving biodiversity for future generations. The cryogenic storage system successfully preserved various creatures in suspended animation, maintaining genetic diversity that would be crucial for environmental restoration. Unlike most Vault experiments, this technology actually worked as advertised and served a beneficial purpose that extended beyond gathering data for Vault-Tec's other projects. However, some of the stored specimens later escaped or were deliberately released, populating Appalachia with dangerous creatures like deathclaws. This shows how even beneficial Vault-Tec projects could create unintended consequences when the stored animals were released into environments where they had no natural predators or ecological balance. Vault 96 proves that Vault-Tec possessed the technology and knowledge to genuinely help restore the post-war world, which makes their decision to focus on human experimentation even more morally inexcusable. They could have built 122 vaults dedicated to preserving human knowledge, culture, and biodiversity, but instead chose to conduct psychological torture experiments. But while Vault 96 preserved life for the future, Vault 101 was designed to trap people in the past forever. Vault 101. Every Fallout 3 player knows Vault 101 as their character's home, but the vault's true purpose was testing the role of an overseer when the vault was never supposed to open. This experiment studied permanent isolation effects by telling residents they could never leave, creating a society that would exist in perpetual underground confinement spanning multiple generations. Despite the mandate to never open, Vault 101 was actually breached multiple times throughout its history. James and the future Lone Wanderer arrived from outside, proving that the vault's isolation was never absolute. When the player character finally leaves to search for their father, it triggers internal conflict about whether the vault should open to the wasteland or maintain its isolation. The experiment basically studied what happens to human psychology when people believe they have no choice and no future beyond their current circumstances. The Vault's society became authoritarian and rigid, with the overseer maintaining control through the promise of security and the threat of exile. Any questioning of authority was treated as a threat to everyone's survival. Vault 101's story shows how isolation can be used as a form of social control, because people will accept almost any authority if they believe it's necessary for their survival. The Vault demonstrates how Vault-Tec could use fear of the outside world to create completely compliant populations who would never question their leadership. But if permanent isolation created compliant populations, Vault 106 shows what happens when you destroy people's ability to distinguish reality from hallucination. Vault 106. Starting just 10 days after sealing, Vault 106 pumped hallucinogenic drugs through its air filtration system, exposing residents to constant psychoactive substances that would gradually destroy their sanity. This wasn't medical research or recreational drug use. This was deliberate chemical warfare against the Vault's own population. The constant drug exposure drove residents violently insane, creating a population of psychotic survivors who attack anyone who enters their territory. The Vault became a nightmare landscape where reality and hallucination blended together, making it impossible for residents to distinguish between actual threats and drug-induced paranoia. Players who visit Vault 106 experience these same hallucinations, getting a taste of what life was like for the original residents. The experiment continued for over 200 years, meaning multiple generations lived and died under constant chemical influence. Children born in the Vault never experienced normal consciousness, growing up in a world where hallucinations were normal and reality was uncertain. The psychological damage was so complete that the surviving residents became essentially feral, retaining just enough intelligence to be dangerous but losing everything that made them human. Vault 106 shows how Vault-Tec could use environmental manipulation to destroy human consciousness itself, proving that they were willing to sacrifice sanity, identity, and basic humanity for research data. But while Vault 106 destroyed individual identity through drugs, Vault 108 eliminated individuality through mass cloning. Vault 108. Designed as a human cloning experiment, Vault 108 repeatedly cloned a human subject named Gary while engineering power system failures to create environmental stress. The experiment was supposed to study whether cloned humans could maintain stable personalities and social structures, but it quickly devolved into something far more horrific. The Vault created 54 Gary clones, with each successive generation becoming more aggressive and unstable than the last. The clones retained the original Gary's memories and basic personality, but the cloning process introduced psychological deterioration that compounded with each iteration. The early clones might have seemed relatively normal, but the later ones were violent and barely functional. Eventually, the Gary clones broke containment and killed all the staff and original residents, leaving only hostile clones who attack anyone who enters their territory. The clones can only say Gary, having lost most language abilities while retaining enough intelligence to coordinate attacks and use weapons. Vault 108 became a nightmare of mass-produced violence where dozens of identical killers roam the halls. The Vault shows how Vault-Tec's cloning technology could create armies of identical soldiers, but it also demonstrates the psychological instability that would make such armies unreliable and dangerous even to their creators. The experiment basically created a preview of what mass human cloning would look like if implemented without proper safeguards or ethical constraints. But while Vault 108 created multiple copies of the same person, Vault 111 focused on preserving single individuals across impossible spans of time. Vault 111. Every Fallout 4 player starts their journey in Vault 111, but most don't realize they were unwitting test subjects in a cryogenic freezing experiment. Residents were told they were entering a normal vault for protection, but they were actually being tested for long-term effects of cryogenic preservation on human physiology and psychology. The experiment was supposed to last indefinitely, with residents remaining frozen while Vault-Tec studied the effects of extremely long-term suspended animation. But staff conflict erupted just 180 days after sealing, killing, or driving away all personnel and leaving the residents frozen without oversight for 210 years. The Institute later used the Vault for their own experiments, treating the frozen residents as a convenient source of genetic material. When the player character finally awakens, they represent the only successful long-term cryogenic preservation subject in the entire experiment. Their survival proves that the technology worked, but their psychological adjustment to the post-war world shows the mental trauma of losing everything and everyone they knew. The player character's quest to find their kidnapped son becomes a study in how someone would cope with complete temporal displacement. Vault 111 demonstrates that even Vault-Tech's more technologically impressive experiments were conducted without informed consent and abandoned when they became inconvenient for the corporation. The Vault shows how human beings were treated as disposable test subjects, even in experiments that could have genuinely benefited humanity. Speaking of experiments that could have benefited humanity, Vault 112 took the promise of virtual reality and turned it into a tool for psychological torture. Vault 112. Under the control of Dr. Stanislaus Braun, Vault 112 trapped residents in virtual reality simulations where they could be tortured, killed, and resurrected indefinitely for the amusement of a sadistic scientist. The Tranquility Lane simulation appeared to be a peaceful 1950s suburban neighborhood, but it was actually a prison where Braun could play God with human consciousness. For over 200 years, Braun repeatedly tortured the residents for entertainment, wiping their memories between sessions and killing them virtually before bringing them back to life. The residents experienced real pain and genuine psychological trauma, but they could never escape or even remember their previous suffering. It was psychological torture designed to be infinitely renewable. The simulation allowed Braun to experiment with human psychology without physical limitations, testing how people would react to impossible situations, moral dilemmas, and direct mental manipulation. He could force residents to commit acts they would never consider in real life, then study their psychological responses to trauma and guilt. The virtual environment made every form of psychological experiment possible, without destroying the test subjects. Vault 112 represents the ultimate expression of Vault-Tech's goals: complete control over human consciousness with the ability to conduct unlimited experiments without consequences for the researchers. The Vault shows what would happen if science completely abandoned ethical constraints and treated human beings as nothing more than data sources. But while Vault 112 trapped people in virtual nightmares, Vault 114 was designed to create real world-class conflict through deliberate social engineering. Vault 114. Built beneath Park Street Station to house wealthy Boston elite in deliberately poor conditions under incompetent, paranoid leadership, Vault 114 was designed to test how entitled wealthy people would react to poverty and bad governance. The experiment would have forced rich people to live in deliberately substandard conditions, while being ruled by someone specifically chosen for incompetence. The Vault was never completed before the bombs fell, so the experiment never took place. The unfinished facility was later used as a base by criminals, and Detective Nick Valentine was found imprisoned there during Fallout 4. The incomplete construction means we'll never know exactly how the class warfare experiment would have played out. But the design documents show that Vault-Tech understood class dynamics well enough to deliberately engineer conflict between social groups. The experiment would have studied whether wealthy people could adapt to poverty, or whether their privileged backgrounds would make them incapable of surviving in harsh conditions. It was basically social Darwinism disguised as research. The fact that this vault was planned shows how thoroughly Vault-Tech understood and was willing to exploit American social tensions for experimental purposes. They recognized that class conflict was a reliable source of human suffering that could be weaponized for research. But while Vault 114 focused on economic class differences, Vault 118 extended that concept by forcing the ultra-wealthy to live as immortal robot brains. Vault 118, designed as a two-wing facility for testing social interactions between ultra-wealthy and working-class residents, Vault 118 was supposed to study class conflict in confined conditions. But funding issues meant only the luxury wing was completed, leaving the working-class wing unbuilt and stranding the wealthy residents without their intended social counterparts. Rather than abandon the experiment, the wealthy residents chose to become robo-brains to survive indefinitely in their luxury accommodations. They voluntarily transferred their consciousness into robotic bodies, essentially choosing immortality over death but trapping themselves in mechanical forms. The Overseer was left to manage immortal robot aristocrats without any working-class residents to provide the intended social conflict. The Vault basically became a twisted version of class privilege, where the wealthy achieved literal immortality while the poor were simply excluded from the experiment entirely. The RoboBrain residents retained their personalities, memories, and social attitudes, but they were stuck in mechanical bodies and confined to their luxury prison forever. Vault 118 shows how Vault-Tech's experiments could create unintended consequences that lasted for centuries, because the RoboBrain residents couldn't die and couldn't leave. The Vault demonstrates how technology intended to preserve human life could become a form of eternal imprisonment when combined with social inequality. But while Vault 118 accidentally created immortal prisoners, Vault 120 represents the kind of ambitious experimental design that never made it into the actual games. Vault 120? This underwater vault in Massachusetts Bay was planned to feature a giant squid overseer and would have included submarine travel, underwater exploration, and Bioshock-inspired themes with aquatic creatures. The vault was cut from Fallout 4 during development, so it never appeared in the final game and we don't know what the experiment would have involved. The concept art and design documents suggest an underwater facility that would have tested human adaptation to aquatic environments, possibly studying whether people could develop new survival skills in completely alien surroundings. The giant squid overseer implies that the experiment would have involved non-human intelligence or genetic manipulation to create aquatic adaptations. Vault 120 represents the kind of creative experimental design that Vault-Tec might have implemented if they had unlimited resources and complete disregard for human safety. An underwater vault would be incredibly dangerous and difficult to escape, making it perfect for experiments that required complete isolation from the surface world. The fact that this vault was designed but never implemented shows how many horrific experiments Vault-Tec might have conducted if they had more time, resources, and development budget. The cut content suggests that the corporation's imagination for human experimentation was essentially unlimited. Looking at every vault across the entire Fallout series reveals the true scope of Vault-Tec's crimes against humanity. These weren't shelters that failed due to technical problems or resource shortages. They were deliberately designed laboratories where human beings were tortured, murdered, and experimented on for data that would ultimately serve the Enclave's plan to abandon Earth entirely. Only 17 of the 122 vaults were genuine shelters, meaning Vault-Tec condemned over 100,000 people to death and suffering while pretending to save them. The vaults show how completely institutional evil can corrupt even the most basic human needs for safety and community. Vault-Tec used people's natural desire to protect their families as a weapon against them, turning parental love into a delivery mechanism for children to experimental facilities. They exploited American cultural values like democracy, competition, and self-reliance as tools for psychological manipulation and social control. Most horrifically, the vaults prove that the technology existed to actually save humanity and rebuild civilization. Vault 8, Vault 76, and other control vaults show that the shelters could have worked if Vault-Tec had actually wanted to preserve human life rather than exploit it. The corporation had the resources, knowledge, and capability to create 122 genuine havens for rebuilding society, but they chose to build 105 torture chambers instead. Almost every vault in Fallout ended in absolute disaster, and this was fully intentional because Vault-Tec didn't build shelters, they built laboratories, and the lab rats were all of the poor dwellers. So today, I'm covering what actually happened to these vaults. Not just what the experiments were, but how they actually ended. And I'm warning you right now, some of these endings are so dark, they make the actual experiments look tame by comparison. Vault 13, Death of a Vault Dweller. Let's start with the very first vault shown in the series. Vault 13 was initially presented as a control vault, a vault without an experiment. But here's the question. If Vault 13 was supposed to be normal, no weird social experiment, no cartoon villain overseer, then why did it still end up producing exile, rebellion, and eventually a full-scale Enclave abduction? Was Vault 13 ever truly a control group? Or was normal just another kind of trap? Yeah, I'm gonna go with a trap. Vault 13, located somewhere in California, often speculated to be near Mount Whitney, was presented as one of the safest bets in the Vault-Tec lineup. Nothing flashy, no obvious gimmick, just a sealed community built to outlast the bombs. That illusion held until 2161 when the vault's water chip failed. You know, the one component keeping everyone from dying of thirst just stops working. Great engineering, Vault-Tec. Really top-notch quality control there. The Overseer draws straws and sends out one resident, later remembered as the Vault Dweller, on December 5th, 2161, to find a replacement. Inside the vault, most residents keep going as if routine will save them. Spoiler alert, it won't. But a rebel faction forms, convinced the Overseer is hiding the truth about the surface and eager to see the world for themselves. The Vault Dweller returns 5 months later with the chip, saving everyone, and the Overseer says, "You're a hero, and you have to leave." I'm sorry, what? You save the entire vault and get exiled? That's like rescuing someone from drowning and they respond by pushing you back in the water. Thanks for the water chip. Now, get out before you give people ideas about freedom. That exile doesn't just remove a person, it fractures the vault's identity. The rebels finally act, leaving Vault 13 to follow the unknown future that the Vault Dweller proved was possible. The Overseer is overthrown, possibly killed. The record becomes conveniently fuzzy there. And in a move that's both logical and darkly comically ironic, the remaining residents replace human leadership with a control computer purchased from the Brotherhood of Steel, trading one overseer for a machine that can't be bribed, guilted, or appealed to. I mean, at least the computer won't exile you for being too competent. Probably. For decades, it worked. That is until 2241, when the Enclave arrives with a coded all-clear signal claiming the surface is safe and it's time to emerge. The vault opens. A family of 3 unseals the door, only to meet an Enclave vertibird assault team. They're immediately gunned down, later labeled as resisting capture. The kind of excuse that only sounds believable if you've never met the Enclave, which, to be fair, they hadn't. But still, the rest of Vault 13 is kidnapped and flown to the Enclave oil rig for use in a world-ending aerosol plan. Yeah, that plan worked out really well for them, but we'll get to that in another video. And as a final insult, Vault 13 becomes a dumping ground for supposedly failed intelligent Deathclaw experiments. Except the Deathclaws aren't dumb at all. They're merely pretending. They turn the vault into their own community, with only the inconvenient fact that claws aren't great for pressing small buttons. From there, Vault 13's ending splits into possibilities. Extermination, capture, or survival through a voice module that lets Deathclaws interact with the vault systems. The good ending is famously bugged in-game, but fans point to later intelligent Deathclaw traces as evidence that it might still be the intended canon. So, what was the point of bringing up Vault 13 first? Well, it matters, because it exposes a brutal truth. Even when a vault looks normal, it's still vulnerable to engineered dependence, internal fracture, and external manipulation. The failure of the water chip shows how a single logistical weakness can control an entire society. The Exile shows that even salvation can be punished if it threatens authority. And the Enclave's infiltration of Vault 13 ultimately proves the vault wasn't just a shelter. It was a resource waiting to be claimed. And that raises the question this video hopes to answer. If this is what happens to one of the most standard vaults ever built, then what did Vault-Tec do to the vaults that weren't meant to be normal at all? Let's move to the next vault where the experiment isn't a hidden twist. That's the entire point. Vault 8. Literally, 1984. Do you think the world today is dystopian enough? Cool, because Vault City is what happens when civilization not only survives the apocalypse, but then immediately decides the real enemy is everyone else. The scary part isn't that Vault City is evil, it's that Vault City thinks it's ethical. Let that sink in for a moment. Vault City, formerly Vault 8, presents itself as a pristine model society. Clean streets, bright lights, neat and tidy uniforms, and a proper government unlike most of the wasteland. But that shine comes with a price tag, massive walls, heavy turrets, and a rigid social order that separates citizens from everyone deemed too poor, too dirty, or too wasteland to belong. If you don't meet their standards, you don't get welcomed. Quite the opposite, actually. You get managed, kept outside the gates, and treated like a necessary inconvenience. And the rules don't stop at the front door. Vault City leans hard into controlled living, strict civic expectations, tightly monitored behavior, and leadership that speaks to people like they're components in a machine, to the point that their welcome booth has a citizen who relies on nothing but a pamphlet to even communicate with you. I mean, imagine being so bureaucratic you can't even greet visitors without a script. That's not efficiency. That's a cry for help. Even the little details are telling. When a place starts obsessing over who's fit, pure, and acceptable, you're not looking at a community anymore. You're looking at a filter. But a filter for what? Here's the twist. If you didn't already see it coming, Vault City wasn't even one of the crazy experiment vaults. So why does it feel like one anyway? By 2241, Vault City's biggest crisis wasn't starvation or raiders, it's that the outside world refused to disappear. Their neighbor, the ghoul town of Gecko, created both a problem and a solution. Gecko's reactor helps keep Vault City powered, but it also creates tensions over contamination and undesirables. That dependency makes Vault City furious because it proves a humiliating truth. Their perfect society still needs help from people they look down on. So they do what they always do, try to outsource their morals. You'll see officials who want compromise, but you'll also see voices in power pushing for harsher options, including using mercenaries to solve problems permanently. Vault City doesn't just fear the wasteland, it wants the wasteland to stay weak so Vault City can stay superior. This is why Vault City is so important. Even without a flashy Vault-Tec gimmick, it becomes a very intentional prototype for what the Enclave mindset looks like in practice. Order through exclusion, safety through segregation, and progress that only applies to the chosen few. Vault City isn't a cautionary tale about chaos without order. It's a warning about stability without empathy. And honestly, that's scarier than most vault experiments. Vault 77, Puppet or Puppeteer. Vault-Tec didn't just love hostile environments, they especially loved impossible ones. Thus, Vault 77 decides to ask one of the nastiest questions of all. If you lock one person away with nothing but silence, how long before they invent a second voice and start not only believing but doing what it tells them? Yeah, that's gonna be a fun time. Picture this. The Great War hits, the door seals, and it's just one man in a vault. No family, no neighbors, no routine, just the hum of machinery and a cardboard box. The moment he understands he's truly alone, he collapses. Days of pounding on the vault door, begging for an answer that never comes. After days and weeks without an answer, he opens the box. Inside there's hand puppets, a Vault Boy mascot, a grandmother, a king, and a dog. It's almost funny until you realize the joke is an experiment. Isolation isn't the background, it's the weapon. This is Vault-Tec stripping away every stabilizer humans rely on. Community, accountability, critical thinking, just to see what replaces it. And at first, what replaces it looks harmless, like nothing more than simple make-believe. Kind of like what video games are to people. Distractions or coping mechanisms from the real world. Hustle and bustle. When you have no one, your brain doesn't stay quiet. It improvises. So the man does what a lonely mind always does. He tells stories. He assigns roles. He makes the puppets talk because someone has to talk. The grandmother bakes pies. The king makes grand declarations. The dog barks on cue. It's childish, sure, but it's also survival. He's building companionship out of scraps, stitching a social world together with nothing but fabric and desperation. This is the key tragedy of Vault 77. It starts as coping, but coping can rot into dependency when there's nothing real left to anchor you. And then, one puppet stops following the script. But the Vault Boy was different. The Vault Boy spoke to the man. It said things that he didn't make it say. Not comforting things, not helpful things, devious things, cruel things. One night, the king had been murdered, with the Vault Boy initially taking responsibility, but later revealing it was the man who had murdered the king. That's the core horror of Vault 77. Whether it's possession or projection, the result is the same. The line between actor and audience collapses. The man no longer knows where he ends and the puppet begins. That's not a metaphor. That's actual dissociative identity disorder with a fabric accomplice. Leaving the vault doesn't cure the damage. It simply takes it outside. He finally tries to leave, only to find a warehouse-sized rad scorpion waiting outside, like the wasteland itself is guarding the punchline to a long, stale joke. After that, he moves through the world in fragments. A ghoul from a worse vault, a giant ant he rides, and raiders he kills at the puppet's urging. At that point, the puppet isn't entertainment anymore. It's permission, something he can wear on his hand and call the reason. People don't fear him because he's any kind of tactical genius. They fear him because he's proof that a human mind can become a weapon when it's hollowed out the right way, even with something as friendly and non-threatening as a hand puppet. And the wasteland does what it always does with cowardice and superstition. It turns it into a legend. Years later, he holed up in a house demanding tribute from anyone who entered, not so much to enrich himself, but more to keep the puppet happy. And even by 2277, 200 years after Vault 77 was sealed, the sight of a Vault 77 jumpsuit was enough to make hardened raiders and slavers panic. That's the final cruelty. Vault-Tec didn't just run an experiment. They manufactured a roaming consequence, an urban legend built from isolation, paranoia, and a puppet that may have never spoken at all. And if Vault 77 shows what happens when one mind collapses in isolation, the next Vault proves what happens when an entire community is manipulated into destroying itself. Vault 11, the death penalty. Vault deep in the Mojave sits Vault 11. And unlike most vaults, it's completely empty. When its residents first entered, the door sealed shut behind them and couldn't be opened, and the vault computer told them of the vault's special rule each year. One person must enter a special execution chamber. If they didn't do that, the vault's life support systems would shut down, killing everyone. Only the original overseer knew this before the door sealed, and when the others found out he'd kept it secret, they democratically decided that the overseer should be the first sacrifice. Thus began the proud Vault 11 tradition of electing an overseer every year and sending them to die when their term ended. Yeah, democracy at its finest. Soon, elections became a twisted parody of American politics. Posters littered the halls. Don't vote for Glover. His family needs him. Rumors about Haley are baseless. Vote Stone for overseer. And just like real life, several political parties formed large voting blocks that would pull their votes together to control who lived and who died. Over time, these blocks grew more powerful and corrupt. The The leader of one of these blocks eventually forced a woman named Catherine Stone to cheat on her husband with him, or her husband would be nominated for overseer, guaranteeing his death. She did what he said, and then the block leader nominated her husband anyway. Catherine responded with what people who study politics commonly call Plan B, mass murder. She went full Rambo, hunting down every Justice Block member she could find. In any other vault, she'd have been executed. In Vault 11, however, that would be a waste. In fact, this made her the perfect candidate for overseer. However, this was exactly what she wanted for 3 reasons. 1, she got revenge on the voting block that betrayed her. 2, her being nominated meant her husband wasn't saving him. And 3, as overseer, she had the authority to alter the vault computer programming, changing the yearly selection of overseer from an election to be chosen completely and totally randomly. This, to put it lightly, was not received well. And by that I mean a full-blown civil war erupted as the vault lost its mind, with voting blocks going into an all-out revolt. When the fighting finally ended, there were only 5 survivors. Those last 5, broken and done with it all, decided to end the cycle. They marched into the sacrifice chamber together, telling the Vault AI that they are done. No longer will they send one to die, but they will die as one. And then a pre-recorded message congratulated them. The Vault AI was never going to shut off the life support. They had passed the vault test. The vault door unlocked and they were all free to go. So all that death and chaos and betrayal was for absolutely nothing. Of the 5, 4 immediately shot themselves. The 5th walked out into the Mojave, never to be seen again. If Vault 11 shows the danger of human nature, the next vault shows what happens when you remove the human part entirely. Vault 87, the super mutant hotspot. Vault 87 is arguably the closest we get to a genuine horror movie in Fallout, or at least one that won't get them sued by Naughty Dog. Whatever its original experiment was supposed to be was scrapped in 2076 when the US government decided to repurpose it as a secondary testing site for the forced evolutionary virus. It made sense since West Tech's main facility in California was probably gonna get nuked. So setting up a backup lab in a bomb-proof vault was good planning. Good for the scientists, anyway, not for the residents. So when the bombs fell, the dwellers crowded into a death trap. And I mean this literally. Within the first decade or so, over 90 deaths were reported, an insane number for any vault. In most cases, the bodies were quickly disposed of, except they weren't. 90% of those deaths were fake. The so-called deceased were abducted and taken to the restricted experimental wing for FEV experiments. The virus had been modified to emphasize certain beneficial traits: strength, endurance, resistance. It created super mutants. Most subjects gained muscle mass, lost all their hair, and lost most of their brain function. At least one forgot how to breathe and simply died. Yeah, the FEV was that stable. And again, I need to emphasize that transforming from FEV exposure is the most excruciating thing a human being can go through. Imagine pulling a muscle, except it's every single muscle on your body, along with every bone violently pushing and growing and morphing. And of course, it could just not work. And you end up dying as your body grows 8 spleens, but destroys your lungs because FEV isn't stable. But of course, the scientists kept going because progress was progress. And of course, with so many people disappearing, much of the rest of the vault was in mourning. One technician started hearing children's voices echoing through the walls and was told he was going insane. He wasn't. He was hearing the kids from Little Lamplight, a nearby cave where children had taken refuge after the war. But that's another whole thing we might get into in another video. Another man who was told his wife had died decided 5 stages of grief was too much and stopped in rage. He was convinced the scientists had killed her and plotted to murder them. We don't know exactly what happened, but we can make an educated guess. The grieving husband broke into the restricted labs to attack the scientists, and the test subjects escaped in the process. Mentally broken super mutants rampaged through the vault, killing or converting everyone they found. When they ran out of people to eat or turn into more of their own, they left the vault to plague the Capital Wasteland's people, killing and eating the weak, while bringing the strong back to make into more super mutants. But there's one more tragedy in this, one more twist that makes this whole thing read like a Stephen King book. The man's wife wasn't a test subject. She just died of cancer, one of the very few natural deaths in the vault. The doctors just failed to properly console a grieving man, and he went off the deep end. So Vault 87 and the entire Capital Wasteland by extension didn't collapse because of the horrible, inhumane experiments. It collapsed because of one man's misunderstanding and the failure of doctors to realize how badly he was grieving. And speaking of turning people into something inhuman, let's jump to Vault 112. Vault 112, the virtual hell. In the Capital Wasteland, under a pretty unremarkable garage infested with mole rats, lies Vault 112. It's one of the smallest vaults in the series. But it's not the size that matters, but how much it traumatizes people. On paper, Vault 112 sounded like paradise. Every resident would live inside a virtual reality utopia. Each person was sealed in a stasis pod and uploaded into a simulation where every desire was fulfilled. In any other context, yeah, that would be dystopian. But when the world ends and you're stuck in a glorified basement, screw it, plug me in. To make things even better, the Vault's overseer was Dr. Stanislaus Braun himself, a brilliant German scientist that had moved to the US and was responsible for multiple pre-war breakthroughs, including the Garden of Eden creation kit. There wasn't anyone alive that had better knowledge of that kind of tech than him, especially after the bombs fell. If anyone could keep the simulation running, it was him. Unfortunately, Braun is the problem, because Vault 112 was his reward from Vault-Tec and the US military for years of service. A personal kingdom where he could play God with the dwellers as his toys. Imagine Sword Art Online and Braun was the admin. The simulation was his playground and he got bored quickly. So he started torturing the other people for fun. Sometimes physically, sometimes emotionally. But hey, the good news was they didn't remember it because he kept wiping their memories. The residents would suffer, then forget, and Braun would start again. An infinite loop of cheerful ignorance, sudden extreme trauma, and back to life as usual over and over and over again. And ignorance is bliss. Because one resident, Old Lady Dithers, wasn't properly plugged into the simulation. So she was aware she was in one and remembered the horrible stuff Braun did. I don't know what's worse, knowing that she's in a simulation or that no one else believes her. And if you're wondering why you find them all still alive in Fallout 3, 200 years later, it's because their pods keep them in biological stasis. If they step out, they would probably die instantly, either rapidly aging or infection. But so long as they stay inside, they get to live and be tortured forever. Yay. In-game, when you go into the simulation, you get two options. Play along with Braun's twisted games until he's satisfied and lets you go. Or hack the system and kill everyone but Braun, freeing the Vault dwellers from purgatory while trapping Braun in a new one since he's stuck in his simulation alone forever. So yeah, virtual torture for 200 years is bad. But you want to know what's worse? Becoming fertilizer for a plant that turns you into a puppet, a hungry puppet. Vault 22, the green hell. In every other vault, you eat plants. In Vault 22, the plants eat you. Vault 22 is easily one of Fallout's most infamous vaults, and does deserve a spot on this list. I don't know, it just feels like everyone who has made a video on vaults or New Vegas has talked about it, and I'd be torn apart in the comments section if I didn't cover it here. So here we go. The vault was staffed by pre-war scientists trying to solve global hunger by genetically modifying crops. It's a noble idea, since even ignoring the rest of the world who are undoubtedly doing worse. By the 2070s in the USA, international trade had collapsed. The US population had ballooned past 400 million, and shortage riots were becoming more and more common. Feeding America was becoming a problem. Vault 22 was supposed to be the solution to that problem, and it was promising. The government and a few private partners donated plenty of money and biosamples, including a new fungal strain from the geniuses over at Big Mountain Research Facility. That fungus, Beauveria mordicana, was basically Fallout's version of Cordyceps from The Last of Us. It infected its host, killed it, then puppeted the corpse to spread spores to new victims. Its purpose was to eradicate pests that would usually ruin crops. Unfortunately, it had three main issues. The first was it took as long as 3 weeks from infection to kill the pest. The second was because of the way it spread. Needing close proximity to spores, it didn't work with any animals that weren't social and spent time around others. And third, it could infect people. And that was the true experiment of Vault 22. Big Mountain, in collaboration with Vault-Tec, wanted to see what would happen in a sealed environment with a recycled air system and a few hundred test subjects. The infection spread fast. Vault dwellers started getting chills, fevers, and a hacking cough caused by the fungus coating the lungs. The fungus sunk deep into the body enough to force it to violently reject any antifungal treatments. Eventually, organs shut down and people died. And then we get to the bad part, because then people got back up again as spore carriers who would attack any uninfected. By 2096, the Vault was in chaos with an airborne plague and literal zombies. The last scientists planned to flood the lowest level with gas and ignite it, going literal scorched earth to try and burn out the infection. But the spore carriers somehow sensed the gas and swarmed the team before they could trigger the blast. By 2096, barely 20 years after the Great War, Vault 22 was lost. The survivors fled north, leaving the door open behind them. The plants grew unchecked, covering the vault and the surrounding area in lush greenery, a stark, horrifying contrast to the surrounding Mojave Desert. Thankfully, the spores aren't seemingly able to spread in the open air, but anyone foolish enough to go inside never comes back. The vault's green exterior lures explorers in, and the spore carriers make sure they stay forever. And the story doesn't even end there. The handful of survivors who escaped fled into Zion National Park, hardened by what they'd seen. They became isolationist, violent, and worse, still infected. Some died of the disease. Others died when a certain very angry army veteran went open season on them after they ate the locals to survive. Their bodies eventually rose again and retreated into Zion's caves, where the fungus could grow undisturbed. As for the last survivors of Vault 22 that fled once again out of Zion, we never hear from them again. But given their social skills and the fact they were infected, I don't think they or anyone else around them had a happy ending. At least Vault 22's horror has a clear ending. The next Vault's tragedy is that nobody remembers it happened at all. Vault 76, The Forgotten Heroes. A spin on a vault not talked about very much on these sorts of videos because of how vanilla it seems. Now you might be saying, but Ghoul, Vault 76 was a control vault. Everyone lived in luxury for 25 years before leaving. And to that, I say yes. But in the words of contemporary philosopher Soulja Boy, have you considered the implications? Because, look, Fallout 76 is a fun game. It's the same thing here. Sure, the game is easy for us to play. But imagine what our in-game characters are actually going through. Vault 76's residents, handpicked successful businessmen and women and their kids, were expecting to leave the vault and rebuild West Virginia. At best, the dangers they were prepared for were radiation poisoning, environmental pollution, and some raiders. But when they opened that door on Reclamation Day 2102, what did they find? The scorched plague turning people into crystalline hive mind zombies, scorch beasts, literal dragon-sized mutated bats that scream sonic attacks, the blood eagles torturing people for fun, and oh yeah, everyone who tried to help before them. The responders, the Free States, the Brotherhood of Steel, all dead. But the residents adapted. They cured the scorched plague. They stopped Atlas from destroying Appalachia. They fought raiders and cultists. They built entire settlements. They saved West Virginia. And then what? Nothing. Appalachia is never mentioned again in any later Fallout game. Not once. Yes, that's mostly because 76 came out most recently. But until it's mentioned in a future game, I'm counting its omission as canon. All your victories, curing the scorched plague, saving Appalachia from disaster after disaster, building literal cities from scratch, none of it mattered. Even in Fallout 3, when you go to the pit, a stone's throw from the game area of Fallout 76, and where you actually go in Fallout 76, there's no mention of the Vault 76 dwellers anywhere. Which means, one thing, everything you built became dust, and every sacrifice you made was erased by time. The only thing worse than failing to achieve greatness is achieving it and being completely forgotten. And personally, that's at least disturbing to me. Vault 95, the cruelest relapse. Vault 95 is proof that Vault-Tec didn't just conduct experiments, they crafted psychological torture disguised as rehabilitation. The Vault housed 72 chem addicts and offered a full rehabilitation program. No chems, supportive community, structured recovery, and for 5 years, it worked. Every single resident stayed clean, overcame withdrawals, and built new lives. It was a genuine success story, except one of them wasn't an addict. Randall Gutierrez was a Vault-Tec plant, tasked with monitoring the program and documenting results. And after 5 years, Vault-Tec gave him his final order. Open the hidden chem stash and see what happens. Randall did it. He unlocked a secret compartment filled with every chem imaginable, and waited. It didn't take long. One resident found the stash, then another. Within 24 hours, 5 years of sobriety evaporated. Friends turned on each other. Fistfights became brawls. Brawls became murders. Even residents who initially resisted eventually caved when the violence became overwhelming. They figured if everyone else was high and trying to kill them, they might as well get high too. By the end, Vault 95 was a graveyard, bodies scattered through the halls, chems everywhere, and Randall's final terminal entry, cold and clinical, documenting how the subjects failed to maintain sobriety when reintroduced to temptation. What happened to Vault 95? By 2287, the gunners used it as a base of operations, because nothing says defensible position like a vault full of corpses and a dark history. The addiction experiment proved exactly what Vault-Tec wanted, that recovery is fragile and cruelty is easy. And honestly, this might be the most evil vault on this list, because they gave people hope just to destroy it. That's not science. That's sadism with a clipboard. Vault 88, the production line. Vault 88 is one of the few times Fallout shows Vault-Tec's cruelty as a repeatable process. Not just a one-off horror story, but a production line for human experimentation. The setup is explicit. Overseen by Dr. Valerie Barstow, the Vault exists to test prototype systems meant for rollout across other vaults after 2078, under the direction of figures tied directly to Vault-Tec's grand societal preservation plan, including Dr. Stanislaus Braun, the same Braun connected to Vault 112. The experiments weren't designed as isolated curiosities. They were intended as mass-produced experiments within experiments. The vault gives a sharp lens into how Vault-Tec operates. It reveals the infrastructure of experimentation, how the company standardized cruelty so it could be copied, shipped, and scaled. Vault 88's story becomes more disturbing after the Great War because the vault was never finished, but the experiments can still be revived and deployed on people who never consented to any of it. When you explore Vault 88, you find the construction crew now feral and the vault split between intact and unfinished sections. But the critical detail is that the experimental data survives elsewhere, stored at the nearby Vault-Tec Regional HQ. That means Barstow isn't stuck reinventing anything. She can recover the archived protocols and restart testing immediately. The only difference is the target population. Not pre-war citizens, but the wastelanders of the Commonwealth, people with fewer protections, fewer choices, and fewer ways to fight back. This reframes Vault-Tec's evil as something even worse than mad science. It's bureaucratic continuity, because society may crumble, but the paperwork survives. And the paperwork is the weapon. Vault 88 shows that Vault-Tec didn't just design experiments. They designed experiments with adjustable ethics. Like cruelty was a feature you could configure depending on what your manager needed that week. The 4 core prototypes, the Power Cycle 1000, Soda Fountain, Phoropter, and Slot Machine, each come with 3 configurations: an overtly abusive Vault-Tec setting, a compromise setting designed by Team Walrus, and a genuinely beneficial version created by Dr. Ted Riley. This isn't accidental. It's a system that turns morality into a menu, harmful, ambiguous, or helpful, all at the flip of a switch. The Vault-Tec versions make the intended purpose unmistakable, maximize compliance, extract productivity, and accept death as an acceptable byproduct. The Power Cycle 1000 can shock riders to squeeze out more power, up to spontaneous combustion and death. The Soda Fountain dispenses appetite-suppressant soda that drives unnatural weight loss and can escalate into fatal refusal to eat. The Phoropter uses subliminal messaging that produces headaches and can kill. And the Slot Machine turns gambling into coercion, manipulating probabilities to trap players in a loss spiral that effectively locks them into indentured servitude. But out of many, if not all, Vault-Tec scientists, Dr. Ted Riley is probably the most ethical pre-war person to ever work for Vault-Tec. Every one of his team's experiments were not only beneficial to Vault-Tec, but to the user as well. The Power Cycle emits essential oils and pleasant music. The Soda Fountain was plain ordinary caffeine, but enhanced to surpass even Nuka-Cola. The Phoropter actually enhanced eyesight, and the Slot Machine could lose the vault money at the cost of endless winnings. Obviously, Valerie Barstow prefers that the Vault-Tec configurations are used for the experiments. She'll walk out on anyone who only uses the beneficial options devised by Dr. Ted Riley. It took 210 years, but the experiments of Vault 88 could finally be unleashed upon the wasteland. It took 210 years, but the experiments of Vault 88 could finally be unleashed upon the wasteland. And that's the pattern, isn't it? Every vault with an experiment seems designed to fail. But here's the thing that makes the next vault so much worse. It didn't have an experiment at all. No twisted Vault-Tec gimmick, no psychological torture, no hidden agenda. Just a normal vault full of normal people who survived 200 years of nuclear apocalypse perfectly. And then they made one decision that killed them all anyway. Vault 3, trust fall into death control. Vaults were supposed to be boring. No experiments, no twists, just people living underground until the surface was safe again. Vault 3 followed that script perfectly. For over 2 centuries, they thrived. Clean water, functioning systems, organized society, everything Vault-Tec promised but almost never delivered. Then in 2281, a water leak forced them to open the door. And here's where the story goes from successful vault to object lesson in why trust gets you killed. When Wastelanders approached asking for help, Vault 3's residents said yes. They welcomed them in. No weapons checks, no security protocols, no background checks or trial periods, just pure unfiltered trust in the goodness of strangers. Which, in a post-apocalyptic wasteland filled with raiders, cannibals, and people who eat other people's pets for fun, is basically natural selection with extra steps. Except these weren't just any wastelanders. They were the fiends. Drug-addicted psychopaths are so violent they make your average raider look like a mall cop. Led by a maniac named Motor Runner who wears a motorcycle helmet welded shut and commands an army that runs on chems, bloodlust, and bad decisions. The Vault Dwellers, convinced they were helping desperate people, offered food, water, and shelter. They showed the fiends where the armory was kept, where the water purification systems were located, basically handed over a complete tactical map of their own defenses because they thought kindness would be rewarded with kindness. In return, the fiends massacred everyone. Men, women, children. It didn't matter. If you lived in Vault 3, you died in Vault 3. The vault's halls became an abattoir, and the fiends claimed it as their permanent fortress. The motor runner set up shop in the overseer's office, probably sitting in the same chair where someone once made the decision to trust strangers. By 2281, Vault 3 wasn't a shelter anymore. It's a chem den and murder factory. The NCR wants them gone, but can't root them out because the Vault's defensive position is too good. Turns out when you design a structure to withstand nuclear war, it also does a great job protecting psychotic drug addicts from organized military forces. The NCR eventually sends Ranger Andy to deal with Motor Runner. He gets shot in the leg, barely escapes, and spends the rest of his career in Novak telling people about how the Fiends are the worst thing in the Mojave. He's not wrong. So, what's the lesson here? Vault 3 shows that sometimes the deadliest experiment isn't the one Vault-Tec designed. It's the one that happens when you survive 200 years of isolation and forget that the wasteland doesn't care about your good intentions. The residents made it through nuclear war, resource scarcity, and 2 centuries underground, only to die because they forgot the first rule of the apocalypse. Never open the door for strangers. Ever. And speaking of doors that should have stayed closed, the next Vault's door was designed to fail from the start. Vault 19, Red vs. Blue Insanity. Vault 19 had 2 overseers, 2 separate sections, Red Sector, Blue Sector, and absolutely 0 chance of ending well. The experiment was elegant in its simplicity. Induce paranoia through non-violent, non-chemical means, and see what happens when you turn a community against itself without firing a single shot. Vault-Tec didn't need drugs or torture. They just needed architecture, psychology, and a willingness to treat human beings like lab rats in a maze. The vault was physically divided. Red residents couldn't access blue areas without clearance. Blue residents were told the red sector was receiving better resources. Neither side could verify the truth because the overseers controlled all information flow. Then the psychological warfare began. Subliminal messages played through the speakers at frequencies just below conscious hearing. High-pitched noises that created anxiety without obvious cause. Lights flickering in patterns that looked like code but meant nothing. Resources mysteriously going missing, with each side blaming the other. And the overseers? They followed Vault-Tec's playbook to perfection. Deny everything, gaslight residents who asked questions, encourage suspicion, feed the paranoia until it becomes self-sustaining. The red sector blamed the blue sector for stealing food. The blue sector blamed the red sector for sabotaging water pumps. Neither side realized the real enemy was the system designed to make them destroy each other. One blue sector resident, a man obsessed with sunset sarsaparilla, started collecting bottle caps with blue stars. He became convinced the stars were a message from blue sector leadership, a code, proof of a conspiracy. Others thought he'd lost his mind. He probably had, but the Vault's design guaranteed he wouldn't be the last. Paranoia is contagious. One person's delusion becomes another person's theory, becomes a faction's rallying cry. Soon the blue sector had armed patrols. The red sector locked down critical systems. Both sides prepared for a conflict that existed only because Vault-Tec wanted to see if they could manufacture one. Eventually, residents started connecting the dots. The doctor refused to answer questions about inconsistencies in medical records. The overseer played dumb when confronted about missing supplies. The staff became hostile when pressed for transparency. And when people finally figured out they'd been manipulated for years, it was too late to fix the fractures. The vault had been designed to break them, and it succeeded. By 2281, Vault 19 was abandoned except for escaped powder gangers using it as a hideout. The original residents either left or killed each other in the paranoia-fueled violence Vault-Tec engineered from day one. The experiment achieved its goal. Prove that you don't need chems or weapons to destroy a society. Just suspicion, isolation, and a little bit of gaslighting. Vault 19 is proof that Vault-Tec understood something terrifying. Humans will do the dirty work themselves if you just give them a reason to be afraid. And if you think paranoia is bad, wait until you meet a vault where the entire society runs on luck. Vault 21. All bets are off. In Vault 21, everything was decided by gambling, leadership, resource distribution, conflict resolution, romantic partnerships. If you had a disagreement, you didn't vote or debate or compromise. You played a game of chance, and the winner decided reality. It sounds insane. It absolutely was insane. But here's the thing that makes Vault 21 so fascinating. It worked. For over 200 years, Vault 21 maintained a functional society where luck replaced hierarchy. No one could hoard power because the next card flip could strip it away. No one could claim superiority because yesterday's winner was tomorrow's loser. Everyone had equal odds. It was the wasteland's weirdest form of democracy, and against all logic, it functioned. People married based on card games. Leaders were chosen by dice rolls. Trade agreements were sealed with blackjack hands. It was chaos masquerading as order, but it kept the vault stable for 2 centuries. Then Robert House showed up. Mr. House, New Vegas's resident techno-dictator, and a man who calculated the exact moment nuclear war would start and positioned himself to survive it. Didn't like the idea of a vault full of people who refused to accept that some humans are inherently worth more than others. So he did what House always does. He bought it. Well, technically he gambled for it. He challenged Vault 21's residents to a game. The winner takes the vault. Loser walks away. Fair and square, by their own rules. He won. Of course he won. You don't bet against a man who turned probability into a science and used it to survive nuclear annihilation. House didn't cheat. He didn't need to. He was just better at math than people who thought luck was a philosophy. House's first order: fill most of the vault with concrete. The lower levels, where the heart of Vault 21's society existed, were permanently sealed, buried in cement like a tomb. The residents were allowed to stay in the upper section, but only if they converted it into a hotel. Their society, their way of life, their entire 2-century experiment in chance-based governance got entombed in construction material. By 2281, Vault 21 was a tourist attraction. Sarah Weintraub runs the hotel, clinging desperately to the memory of what the vault used to be. Visitors come to gamble, sleep in vault-themed rooms, and leave, completely unaware they're walking on a graveyard of a culture that once thrived on randomness. Sarah still wears her Vault 21 jumpsuit, still talks about the old days, still hopes that maybe, someday, the house will let them excavate the lower levels and rebuild what was lost. He won't. House doesn't do sentiment. Vault 21 didn't fail because of violence or radiation or social collapse. It failed because someone richer and smarter showed up and bought it out from under them. And honestly, that's the most realistic dystopia Fallout ever created. Sometimes you don't lose to monsters or nuclear war, you lose to capitalism and a man with better odds. And speaking of dystopias that feel uncomfortably real, the next vault ran on something even more American than gambling: guns. Lots and lots of guns. Vault 34, the Armory Vault. Vault 34's experiment was straightforward. Give residents unlimited access to weapons and ammunition, then sit back and see what happens. Spoiler alert, nothing good. The vault's armory was stocked beyond any reasonable need. Rifles, pistols, shotguns, explosives, energy weapons, and ammunition for days. More firepower than a small military base. Enough weapons to arm a small country. And unlike every other vault where security controlled the arsenal, Vault 34's residents could access it freely. At first, it created a sense of security. People felt safe knowing they could defend themselves. Then it created a sense of power. Then it created factions, armed factions, with competing ideas about how the vault should run and the firepower to enforce those ideas violently. The problem with giving everyone guns is that eventually someone's going to use them. And in Vault 34, that moment came faster than anyone expected. Tensions escalated over vault policy. Some residents wanted stricter rationing. Others wanted freedom to use resources as they saw fit. Normally, you'd vote, debate, compromise. But when both sides are armed to the teeth, compromise feels like weakness and voting feels like surrender. The first shooting was an accident. At least, that's what people told themselves. A resident got trigger-happy during an argument. Someone died, and suddenly the vault had crossed a line it couldn't uncross. Firefights broke out in the halls. People died in corridors designed to protect them from nuclear war, but utterly unprepared for civil war. Vault security couldn't control the situation because everyone was equally armed. There was no tactical advantage, no authority that couldn't be challenged with bullets. Then the reactor started failing. Maintenance teams couldn't access it safely because the route passed through contested territory. Both factions refused to allow access, each convinced the other would sabotage critical systems. Radiation began leaking into the vault. Panic set in. The violence escalated. People stopped fighting over ideology and started fighting for survival, and the radiation just kept spreading. A group of residents tried to force open the main door to escape. It wouldn't budge. Whether by accident, design, or sabotage, they were trapped. The radiation kept rising. The fighting continued. People kept dying. By 2281, most of Vault 34's residents had devolved into feral ghouls, mindlessly wandering the irradiated, flooded halls. They attack anything that moves, driven by radiation-induced madness and whatever humanity they once had long since burned away. A small group of survivors, the ones who remained sane, is trapped in the flooded reactor section, sending an SOS that might never be answered. They've been stuck there for who knows how long, surviving on scraps and hope, waiting for rescue that probably won't come. The player eventually faces a choice. Seal the vault to cut off the radiation leak, saving the NCR's sharecropper farms that feed thousands but condemning those survivors to a slow death. Or give the survivors control of the vault's systems, saving them but dooming the farms and everyone who depends on them. There's no good answer. Just 2 flavors of tragedy, and you get to pick which one you can live with. Vault 34 proves that when you give people unlimited power and no consequences, they'll destroy themselves faster than any external threat ever could. It's not a vault. It's a thought experiment in why the Second Amendment needs context, and why Vault-Tec should never be allowed near social policy. And if unlimited weapons create chaos, the next 2 vaults prove that gender demographics create something arguably worse. Vault 68, 999 men and 1 woman. 1 woman, 999 men. Vault-Tec's experiment in social collapse through demographic nightmare. We don't know exactly what happened inside. The vault's records are incomplete, destroyed, or deliberately hidden. And frankly, the imagination fills in the gaps with scenarios ranging from bad to apocalyptically horrifying. What we do know, this wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. Vault-Tec carefully selected residents to create a 999.1 gender ratio and then sealed the door, trapping them in a social experiment designed to fail. Did the woman become a dictator, leveraging scarcity into power? A prisoner, trapped by the very people meant to coexist with her? A religious figure, elevated to mythic status? Did the men form factions fighting for her attention, tearing the vault apart in proxy wars over reproductive rights? Did society collapse into violence within weeks? Or did it take months? Did anyone survive? We don't know. And that uncertainty is almost worse than knowing, because your mind fills in the details. And none of them are good. But here's what we can infer. Nothing good happened. You don't design an experiment like this and expect a happy ending. You design it to document how quickly humanity abandons civilization when the social structure becomes mathematically impossible to sustain. Vault-Tec built this vault knowing full well it would destroy everyone inside. They allocated resources, selected residents, built the infrastructure, and then locked the door, fully aware that 1,000 human beings were about to descend into a nightmare. And they did it not because they needed to, but because they wanted data. They wanted to know what would happen. They wanted to compare results with Vault 69 and see if gender changed the outcome. They wanted to fill filing cabinets with reports documenting human suffering. Vault 68 is a ghost. No confirmed survivors, no detailed records, no holotapes explaining the end, just the knowledge that somewhere in the wasteland, 1,000 people were locked in a vault and told to make it work. They didn't, and just to prove Vault-Tec played no favorites and had equal opportunity cruelty, they ran the exact same experiment in reverse. Vault 69, 9999 women and 1 man. Vault 69, 1 man, 999 women. The mirror image of Vault 68's horror. Same experiment. Flipped demographics, equally horrifying implications, and the same disturbing lack of detailed records. Again, we don't know the specifics. We don't know if the man survived the first year. We don't know if the society lasted a week or a decade. We don't know if it ended in violence, despair, exhaustion, or some twisted form of order that barely qualified as civilization. We don't even know if he had a choice in the matter, or if Vault-Tec's experiment required participation whether he wanted it or not. What we do know is, Vault-Tec ran this experiment knowing full well it would destroy everyone inside, just like Vault 68. They just wanted to compare the data and see if biological sex changed the trajectory of social collapse. It's clinical, it's detached, it's evil wearing a lab coat and carrying a clipboard, documenting atrocities with the same emotional investment as a grocery list. The fact that Vault-Tec built 2 of these vaults purely to compare results makes it exponentially worse. 1 might be a sick curiosity. 2 is a pattern. 2 is methodology. 2 means someone at Vault-Tec proposed this, someone approved it, someone allocated a budget, and multiple people worked together to condemn 2,000 human beings to gender-imbalanced hell. Both Vault 68 and 69 exist to answer one question. How quickly does a society collapse when you remove the possibility of normal human relationships and family structures? The answer, presumably, is very quickly. These aren't vaults. They're cruelty engines. Social experiments that never should have left the brainstorming phase. And the fact that Vault-Tec actually built them, populated them, and sealed them shut proves that the real monsters of Fallout were never the super mutants or Deathclaws. They were the people in suits who signed the paperwork. And if demographic manipulation sounds like psychological warfare, the next Vault tried to reprogram minds entirely through sound. Vault 92, The Musician Massacre. Vault 92 was sold as a paradise for artists, the best musicians in America, handpicked for their talent, given state-of-the-art instruments and recording equipment, and told they'd preserve culture for future generations. A vault where art would survive the apocalypse. They weren't told about the white noise generators hidden in the ventilation system. The experiment used subliminal messaging embedded in constant white noise to create obedient super soldiers who would follow orders without question, even under fire. Reprogram musicians into living weapons through audio manipulation. Vault-Tec partnered with military contractors who believed the human mind was just software waiting to be reprogrammed. Play the right frequencies at the right intervals, and you could overwrite free will with obedience. The white noise played constantly, embedded with hypnotic commands. At first, nothing seemed wrong. The musicians played. They recorded. They held concerts for fellow residents. Life in Vault 92 looked exactly like the paradise Vault-Tec had promised. Then people started acting strange, aggressive, paranoid, violent over minor disagreements. Musicians who'd spent years perfecting their craft suddenly attacked each other with instruments as weapons. The subliminal messages weren't creating soldiers, they were creating psychopaths. Turns out, you can't just upload commands into a human brain and expect clean results. The mind fights back, and when it breaks under pressure, it shatters in unpredictable ways. The Overseer kept pushing. More white noise, stronger subliminal messages, longer exposure times. The experiment had to work. Vault-Tec's orders were explicit. Military contracts depended on results. Failure wasn't an option, even as residents descended into madness. It didn't work. It broke them completely. The musicians turned on each other first, then on the staff, then on anyone they could find. Vault 92 became a slaughterhouse, blood painting the walls where sheet music once hung, instruments scattered among corpses, recording equipment smashed. The Overseer's final logs document desperate attempts to contain the violence, then increasingly frantic realizations that containment was impossible. By 2277, the Vault is silent, except for the echo of old violence. Holotapes document the descent into madness step by horrifying step. Terminals show the Overseer's increasingly desperate attempts to justify continuing the experiment even as people died. Even as it became obvious, the white noise was destroying minds instead of controlling them. One holotape features a musician begging the Overseer to stop the experiment. The Overseer refuses, citing contractual obligations to Vault-Tec and the military. Days later, that same musician's body is found with a violin bow embedded in his skull. Vault 92 failed because Vault-Tec forgot a basic truth. The human mind isn't software. You can't just upload commands and expect obedience. You can't brute force free will with frequencies and subliminal messaging, push too hard, and the mind doesn't comply. It shatters. And Vault-Tec learned that lesson the hard way, written in the blood of people who just wanted to make music. And if Vault 92 shows what happens when you try to control minds through sound, the next Vault shows what happens when you control them through absolute authority. Vault 101, the Forever Vault. No one ever enters, and no one ever leaves. The experiment, create a vault with an all-powerful Overseer and see what happens when that position passes from one dictator to the next, generation after generation, with zero accountability or external oversight. Unlike control vaults that would eventually receive an all-clear signal from Vault-Tec to open and repopulate the surface, Vault 101 was never supposed to open, ever. The residents would live, reproduce, and die underground while Vault-Tec studied how absolute power corrupts absolutely when given literal centuries to fester. For decades, it worked exactly as designed. The Overseer controlled everything: information, resources, social structure, even relationships. Dissent was crushed immediately. Conformity wasn't just encouraged, it was survival. You fell in line or you disappeared. The Overseer's word was law. Not metaphorically, literally. There was no appeals process, no checks and balances, no democracy or representation, just one person with total control over 1,000 lives, passing that control to the next Overseer when they died. Generations were born and died without ever questioning the system. Why would they? It's all they'd ever known. The Overseer said the surface was uninhabitable, so it must be true. The Overseer said the door must never open, so it never did. The Overseer said this was the only way to survive, and nobody had evidence to the contrary. Then, in 2277, everything changed when James, the Lone Wanderer's father, fled the vault. He hacked the door controls and escaped to the surface, shattering the fundamental lie that held Vault 101's society together. The door opened. Residents saw the outside world for the first time in 200 years. And it wasn't the radioactive hellscape the Overseer had described. It was just wasteland, dangerous, sure, but survivable, inhabited even. The Overseer tried desperately to maintain control, but the illusion shattered. If the Overseer had lied about the surface, what else had he lied about? People started questioning, rebelling, demanding answers and accountability that the Overseer overseer couldn't provide without admitting to centuries of manipulation. The social order Vault-Tec had carefully cultivated for 2 centuries collapsed in days. The overseer's daughter even turned against him, recognizing that absolute power had corrupted her father into a tyrant. Depending on player choices, Vault 101 either opens to the outside world under new leadership, remains sealed with a different overseer, or falls into chaos and civil war. But the damage is irreversible. The experiment failed the moment someone proved the overseer wasn't as all-powerful as he claimed. Vault 101's tragedy isn't that it was designed to fail. It's that it succeeded for 200 years before one person's choice destroyed everything. That's not a vault. That's a cult with government funding and 2 centuries of institutional momentum. And if Vault 101 controlled people through authority and isolation, the next vault controlled them through chemistry and terror. Vault 106. The Psychedelic Nightmare. 10 days. That's how long Vault 106 lasted before Vault-Tec pumped psychoactive drugs into the air circulation system. 10 days of normal vault life. 10 days where residents believed they were safe. 10 days before Vault-Tec decided it was time to start the real experiment. The experiment: release hallucinogenic gas into the vault's atmosphere and document what happens when an entire population is forcibly drugged and left to descend into madness together. The gas was released on schedule at 1530 hours on day 10. By 1600 hours, Vault 106 had descended into chaos. Some residents fell into hallucinogenic stupors, collapsed in corridors, seeing things that weren't there and unable to distinguish reality from chemically induced nightmares. Others became violent, paranoid, aggressive, attacking anyone nearby because their drugged minds convinced them everyone was an enemy, a monster, a threat that needed to be eliminated. The security chief tried to contain it, issued emergency orders, told unaffected residents to shelter in place and seal their rooms. It didn't work. The gas was everywhere. You couldn't hide from the air. People tried, sealed doors with duct tape, covered vents with fabric, held wet towels over their faces. It didn't matter. The ventilation system was designed to reach every corner of the vault, and Vault-Tec had designed the delivery system to ensure total exposure. By the end of day 10, Vault 106 was a mass grave in the making, bodies stacked in corridors, evidence of people trying to claw their way through solid rock to escape. A mini-nuke detonated near a cave-in, suggesting someone, in their drug-addled desperation, thought they could blast an exit through the vault walls. They couldn't. The walls held. The residents didn't. By 2277, 2 centuries later, the vault was still contaminated. Whatever compound Vault-Tec used in that gas has lingered in the structure itself, absorbed into the walls and floors and ventilation system. Stepping inside Vault 106 triggers immediate hallucinations. Players see enemies that aren't there. Hostile vault residents attacking from every direction, except they're phantoms. Ghosts created by 200-year-old psychoactive compounds are still potent enough to fracture reality. You fight shadows, shoot at nothing, waste ammunition on threats that never existed. It's disorienting, terrifying, a glimpse into what Vault 106's residents experienced, except they had no context, no preparation, and no escape. Vault 106 didn't just kill its residents. It became a permanent toxic zone, a monument to Vault-Tec's willingness to destroy minds for data. The experiment's documentation probably still exists somewhere in a filing cabinet, neatly categorized under psychoactive compounds and long-term effects. And speaking of long-term effects gone horribly wrong, the next Vault created an army of something that definitely wasn't human anymore. Vault 108, Gary. Vault 108 had one job: test the viability of human cloning as a way to repopulate the wasteland. They cloned a man named Gary, then they cloned him again, and again. 54 times total. Each clone was designed to be identical. Same DNA, same baseline physiology, same starting point. In theory, they'd create a stable population capable of surviving and rebuilding. In practice, each clone was more violent and mentally unstable than the last. Gary 1 was manageable, functional, could follow basic instructions and interact with staff without incident. Gary 5 showed signs of aggression. Gary 23 died when scientists tried to remove a hermetically sealed device from his arm. They amputated the limb, and he bled out on the operating table while other Garys watched. By Gary 54, the clones were actively hostile, attacking anyone who wasn't Gary, communicating only with each other, forming a hive mind united by violence and an apparent hatred for non-clone humans. The scientists tried to maintain control. They disposed of the more violent clones to make room for new test subjects, hoping that maybe the next batch would be more stable. Maybe they'd made a mistake in the process. Maybe Gary 55 would be different. The Garys had other plans. They rebelled, coordinated, used their numbers and intimate knowledge of the vault to overwhelm security and slaughter the scientific staff. Turns out, when you create dozens of clones of the same person, they develop a group cohesion that makes resistance nearly impossible. The last terminal entries document scientists barricading themselves in offices while Garys pounded on the doors. Then the entries stop, Draw your own conclusions. By 2277, Vault 108 is populated entirely by hostile Gary clones who communicate exclusively by saying their own name in different inflections, tones, and volumes. Gary could mean hello, or attack, or hunger, or warning, or excitement. Context is everything when your entire vocabulary is one word, and the Garys have apparently developed an entire language out of that limitation. The clones don't age normally. They've survived 200 plus years through some unknown mechanism, seemingly sustained by whatever cloning process created them. They roam the halls in groups, attacking intruders, living in a vault that's half tomb, half cloning lab, surrounded by the corpses of the scientists they murdered. Vault 108 answers a question nobody should have asked. What happens when you create dozens of mentally unstable clones and trap them underground with the people who made them? Answer: Gary. Just Gary. Forever Gary. An army of clones unified by madness, violence, and a single name repeated endlessly through irradiated corridors. And if cloning created monsters, the next vault created corpses through nothing more than corporate negligence and broken promises. Vault 111, frozen in time. Vault 111 promised safety through cryogenic preservation. Freeze the residents until the surface is habitable, then wake them up to rebuild civilization as American heroes. They didn't mention the waking up part was entirely optional and subject to change. When the bombs fell on October 23rd, or 2077, residents of Sanctuary Hills rushed to Vault 111, terrified and desperate. They were told to enter cryopods for decontamination. It was a lie. The pods were cryogenic freezers, and the decontamination was indefinite suspension. The residents entered the pods believing they'd sleep through the worst of the radiation and emerge to a new world in a few years, maybe a decade at most. Instead, they became lab rats in a long-term stasis experiment designed to test human cryogenic preservation. Vault-Tec wanted to know if humans could survive centuries of frozen suspension, and the only way to find out was to freeze people and wait. After 180 days, the Vault staff expected an all-clear signal from Vault-Tec headquarters telling them to begin revival procedures. It never came. Vault-Tec was gone, destroyed in the nuclear war they'd helped orchestrate. Supplies dwindled. The staff panicked. The overseer refused to open the vault or wake the residents, insisting radiation levels were still too high, and they needed to wait for official authorization that would never arrive. The staff mutinied, killed the overseer, tried to leave the vault and seek help. Most died in the wasteland within days, completely unprepared for life outside. The rest died fighting over the vault's remaining supplies. The residents, still frozen, still asleep, still completely unaware that everyone meant to protect them was dead, and they were trapped in mechanical coffins, slowly failing. In 2227, 150 years after the bombs fell, the Institute arrived. They needed genetic material uncontaminated by radiation. Vault 111 was perfect. They unfroze one couple, Nate and Nora. They murdered Nate in front of his wife. They kidnapped his infant son, Sean. Then they refroze Nora as a backup sample and leave, sealing the vault behind them. Everyone else remained frozen, dying slowly as life support systems failed one by one. Asphyxiation, power loss, equipment malfunction. 10 years, frozen, only to suffocate in their sleep, never knowing they'd survived nuclear war only to be killed by corporate negligence. By 2287, when the sole survivor finally wakes up, everyone else in the vault is dead. Frozen corpses preserved in their pods like museum exhibits. Families who thought they were being saved, employees who thought they were helping, all dead because Vault-Tec abandoned them. Vault 111 wasn't designed to save anyone. It was designed to test long-term cryogenic preservation, and the residents were expendable data points in an experiment that outlived the company that created it. The sole survivor lived because the Institute needed a backup sample. Everyone else was just inventory, filed under acceptable losses in a report nobody will ever read, and that's the legacy of Vault-Tec. Frozen corpses, psychotic clones, demographic nightmares, and 200 years of proof that humanity's worst enemy has always been itself. If you survived this deep dive into nuclear-powered corporate evil, check out what happened to every Vault survivor in Fallout. Spoiler, very few of them had happy endings. And that's it. We're done. If you enjoyed this video and want to see what happened to every Vault survivor in Fallout, click the video on screen.